I found Sarah Garrett's boots first. They were sitting side by side on a granite outcropping 3 miles into Thornwood National Forest, laces still tied, soles caked with mud that had dried days ago in the summer heat. Her socks were folded neatly inside them. The rest of her was gone. That was 6 weeks ago, and I have not slept properly since. My name is Daniel Moss, and I have been a ranger at Thornwood for 11 years. I thought I knew these woods. I thought I understood the rhythms of this place, the way morning fog rolls through the valleys, the patterns of deer migration, the places where black bears den in winter. I was wrong. There is something else here, something that has always been here, and it has started to move. The morning Sarah disappeared began like any other morning in late June. I was at the Ridgeline station alone, brewing coffee in the small kitchen while the radio crackled with static and the occasional check-in from rangers farther south. Sarah had signed out the previous afternoon for a solo photography hike along the Widows Creek Trail, a moderate 6-mile loop that wound through old-growth forest before circling back to the main road. She was an experienced hiker, 28 years old, a freelance nature photographer who had worked in parks across the West. She knew what she was doing. When she did not return by nightfall, I was not immediately concerned. Hikers sometimes misjudge distances or stop to capture the perfect shot as the light changes. But when her car was still parked at the trailhead the next morning, I called it in and organized a search. We found her camera first, a professional Nikon with a telephoto lens, lying in the middle of the trail 2 miles in. The lens was shattered. The camera body was intact, but the memory card was missing. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric caught on branches. Just the camera lying there in the dirt as if she had simply set it down and walked away. The prints around it were strange. Her boot treads were clear enough heading north along the trail, but then they stopped abruptly beside a massive rotting hemlock. After that point, there was nothing. The forest floor was soft with decomposing needles, and it should have held impressions, but there was only smooth, undisturbed ground, as if she had simply ceased to exist at that exact spot. We searched in expanding circles. We brought in dogs. They picked up her scent easily enough, following it to the same hemlock where her prints ended, and then the dogs did something I had never seen in 15 years of search and rescue work. They stopped. All 3 of them sat down simultaneously, whining, and refused to go any farther. Their handler, a woman named Marie Chen, who had worked with those dogs for a decade, looked at me with confusion that bordered on fear. She tried to coax them forward. They would not move. One of them, a German shepherd named Duke who had found 12 missing persons over his career, began to shake. We continued without the dogs. The search went on for 5 days. We covered 40 square miles of forest. State police brought in helicopters with thermal imaging. Volunteers from 3 counties showed up to walk grid patterns through the underbrush. We found nothing except her boots on that outcropping on day 4 and a single white button from her shirt caught in a blackberry thicket half a mile from where her camera had been. The button was torn, ripped away with force. That was all. On the 6th day, the official search was called off. Sarah Garrett was listed as missing, presumed dead, and her parents came from Ohio to collect her belongings. I watched her mother fold Sarah's clothes in the small cabin she had rented in town, and I wanted to tell her something that would help, but I had nothing. The forest had swallowed her daughter and left almost no trace. That night I returned to the Ridgeline station and sat on the porch watching darkness fill the valley below. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. It was summer, and there should have been the constant buzz of insects, the calls of owls beginning their nightly hunts, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. Instead, there was only silence, deep and complete, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I have worked in remote places for most of my adult life, and I have learned to read the moods of wild country. That night, the forest felt wrong. It felt watched. I went inside and locked the door, something I had never done before in all my years at Thornwood. Sarah was not the first. I did not know it then, but over the following weeks I would dig through old files in the basement of the main ranger station, and I would find a pattern stretching back decades. The records were incomplete, scattered across different filing systems and archived in boxes that smelled of mildew and time. But the pattern was there if you knew what to look for. In 1978, a geology student named Michael Brennan vanished while studying rock formations in the northern section of the park. His tent was found intact, his sleeping bag still warm, his boots lined up outside the entrance. He was never seen again. In 1985, 2 deer hunters, brothers named Frank and Lou Messina, failed to return from a trip into the backcountry. Their truck was found at a Forest Service road 5 miles from the trailhead. The doors were open. The engine was running. Their rifles were still in the gun rack. A search team found Frank's body 3 weeks later in a ravine 8 miles from where the truck had been abandoned. The coroner ruled it death by exposure but noted extensive bruising across his torso and legs consistent with a fall from a great height. Lou was never found. In 1993, a ranger named Thomas Webb radioed in that he was investigating unusual activity near the old Mackenzie fire tower. His last transmission was cut off mid-sentence. When backup arrived 6 hours later, they found his truck parked at the base of the tower, but Thomas was gone. His radio was on the driver's seat, still turned on. His pack was in the back. His service weapon was missing from its holster. They found the gun 2 days later in a stream bed 4 miles away. It had been fired 3 times. They never found Thomas. There were others. A botanist in 1998, a family of 4 in 2003, whose campsite was found abandoned with dinner still cooking on their camp stove. A trail maintenance worker in 2011 who vanished between 2 sections of trail less than a mile apart. 17 people over the course of 40 years, all of them experienced outdoorsmen and women, all of them familiar with wilderness survival, all of them gone without adequate explanation. The official explanation for most of these cases was accidental death due to falls, exposure, animal attacks, or disorientation, but the details never quite added up. There were too many abandoned belongings, too many signs of sudden flight, too many dogs that refused to track, too many searches that ended in confusion and frustration. I began to wonder if someone in the Park Service had noticed the pattern years ago and simply decided it was better not to connect the dots. It was easier to treat each incident as isolated rather than admit that something was systematically taking people from these woods. After Sarah disappeared, I started paying attention to things I had previously dismissed. The reports that came in from hikers about strange sounds in the forest, the feeling of being followed on empty trails, the way certain areas of the park seemed to empty of wildlife at specific times of year. I began keeping my own records, noting anything unusual that crossed my desk or came in over the radio. What I found disturbed me. There were dozens of reports every year of people experiencing what they described as an overwhelming sense of dread while hiking certain trails. The locations were consistent. The Widow's Creek Trail where Sarah had vanished, the northern approach to Mackenzie Tower where Thomas Webb had disappeared, a stretch of old fire road called Deadfall Curve, the abandoned Fletcher Ranger Station in the remote northwest corner of the park. People reported feeling watched. They reported hearing heavy footsteps keeping pace with them through the trees. They reported a smell like rotting meat and wet earth. Most concerning were the reports of knocking sounds, deep wooden knocks that echoed through the forest at dusk. Dozens of hikers had reported hearing them over the years. The knocks always came in patterns of 3, separated by long silences, and they seemed to move through the trees as if whatever made them was circling, searching. I had heard the knocks myself over the years, but I had always assumed they were trees falling or branches striking together in the wind. Now I was not so sure. I began hiking the trails alone after my shifts ended, going to the places where people had vanished or reported strange encounters. I told myself I was looking for evidence, for some rational explanation that would make sense of Sarah's disappearance and all the others. But the truth was darker than that. I was looking for it, whatever it was. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. I wanted proof that I was not losing my mind. The forest in summer should be alive with sound and movement, but as I walked those trails in the long evening light, I found only silence and stillness. The birds seemed to avoid certain areas entirely. The normal debris of the forest floor, fallen branches and scattered pine cones and animal scat, was absent in places, as if even the small processes of decay had been interrupted. The trees themselves looked wrong in those spots. Their bark was scored with deep parallel gouges running vertically up the trunks, marks that looked like they had been made by something massive dragging its claws along the wood as it passed. The gouges were too high to be from any bear. They were 8, 9, 10 feet up the trunks, strips of bark peeled away to reveal pale wood underneath. I measured them carefully. The spacing between the marks suggested something with a handspan of nearly 12 inches. I took photographs. I sent samples of the bark to a wildlife biologist I knew at the state university. She called me back 3 days later, and her voice had an edge to it I had never heard before. She said the marks were definitely made by claws, but the depth and length of the scoring suggested an animal far larger than any native species. She said the force required to gouge wood that deeply would be immense. She asked me if we had received any reports of escaped exotic animals in the area. I told her no. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said she could not explain the marks and suggested I contact a forensic specialist if I was seriously concerned. I did not call anyone else. I knew what they would say, that I was seeing patterns where none existed, that the marks could be from any number of sources, that the disappearances were tragic but explainable, that the woods were just woods and I was letting stress and grief cloud my judgment. But I knew what I had seen. More than that, I knew what I had felt. Because by then, I had felt it too. That sensation of being watched that so many hikers had reported. I felt it strongest near the Fletcher Station, the old ranger outpost that had been abandoned in the early 90s after budget cuts forced the park to consolidate operations. The station sat in a small clearing surrounded by old-growth forest 8 miles from the nearest maintained trail. The building was falling apart, its roof sagging, its windows broken, its porch rotting into the ground. Moss covered the northern wall, and young trees grew up through gaps in the foundation. I had been there a few times over the years to check on the structure, and I had always found it merely sad, a monument to shrinking budgets and changing priorities. But when I hiked out there in mid-July, 3 weeks after Sarah vanished, I found something else. The feeling hit me half a mile before I reached the clearing. A pressure against my chest, a tightness in my throat, a sudden conviction that I should turn around and leave immediately. I forced myself forward. The trail was overgrown but still passable, and the afternoon sun filtered down through the canopy in dusty shafts of light. Everything looked normal. Everything felt wrong. The forest was absolutely silent. When I emerged into the clearing and saw the Fletcher Station, I stopped. The door was open. I had been here 9 months ago in October, and I had checked that door personally. It had been locked, the padlock secure. Now it hung open, swaying slightly in a breeze I could not feel. I approached slowly. The porch boards creaked under my weight. I called out but received no answer. The interior was dark and smelled of mold and rot and something else, something organic and foul, like spoiled meat. I turned on my flashlight and stepped inside. The main room was empty except for an old desk and filing cabinet. Leaves and debris covered the floor. Animal droppings suggested mice and possibly raccoons had taken up residence, but there was something else. In the center of the floor, someone had arranged objects in a careful circle. I moved closer and felt my stomach turn. The objects were bones, small bones, bird and rodent from the size of them, cleaned completely of flesh and laid out in a precise pattern. At the center of the circle was a small pile of items that did not belong. A silver bracelet, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, a military dog tag, a child's plastic hair clip, a wedding ring. I recognized the bracelet immediately. Sarah had worn it every day. I had seen it on her wrist when she signed out for her hike. I stood there for a long time staring at those objects while something cold moved through my chest. This was not the work of an animal. Animals do not collect human belongings and arrange them in careful patterns. Animals do not create shrines. I took photographs. I bagged the items as evidence. I searched the rest of the building and found nothing else except more of those deep claw marks on the inside walls, gouges that ran from floor to ceiling in long parallel lines. When I stepped back outside, the sun had moved and shadows had filled the clearing. The forest around me was still utterly silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. I began walking back toward the trail, and I had made it perhaps 20 yards when I heard it. 3 deep knocks from somewhere in the forest to my left. The sound was like wood striking wood, but amplified, resonant, carrying across the distance with unnatural clarity. I stopped and turned toward the sound. The knocks came again, the same pattern of 3, but farther away now, deeper in the trees. I waited. Silence returned and stretched out for perhaps 2 minutes. Then the knocks came again from a different direction, behind me and to the right. Whatever was making that sound was circling me. I started walking again, moving quickly now, not quite running, but close. The trail seemed longer than I remembered. The trees pressed in close on either side, and the light was fading faster than it should have been. I kept my hand on the radio at my belt, but I did not call in. What would I say? That I was scared. That something was following me through the woods. That I had found a collection of human belongings arranged by something that should not exist. They would think I was cracking up. Maybe I was. The knocks followed me all the way back to the main trail. They stayed in the trees, always just out of sight, maintaining the same distance. 3 knocks. Long silence. 3 more knocks from a new position. It was hurting me. I realized that with sudden cold clarity, it was keeping me moving in a specific direction, pushing me along like a shepherd moves sheep. When I finally reached my truck where I had parked it on the Forest Service Road, I was breathing hard and my hands were shaking. I got in and locked the doors and sat there for a moment, forcing myself to calm down. The knocking had stopped. The forest around me looked normal in the late afternoon light. I started the engine and drove back to the Ridgeline station, and I did not stop until I was inside with the doors locked and the lights on. That night I filed a report about the items I had found at the Fletcher station. I submitted the photographs and evidence bags to the regional office. I requested that Sarah's case be reopened and that someone from the main office come to conduct a thorough investigation of the area. I did not mention the knocking sounds or the feeling of being followed. I kept my language clinical and professional. 2 days later, I received a call from my supervisor, a man named Gerald Hutchins, who worked out of the state capitol and rarely visited the actual parks he oversaw. He thanked me for the report. He said the items would be examined and that he appreciated my diligence. Then he suggested gently that I might be working too hard, that Sarah's disappearance had clearly affected me, that perhaps I should consider taking some time off. I told him I was fine. He said he would send someone to collect the evidence, but that I should focus on my regular duties and leave the investigation to the proper authorities. The conversation left me feeling hollow. I understood what he was really saying. Stop digging. Stop asking questions. Accept that these things happen in wild places and move on. But I could not move on. Because 3 nights after I found those items at the Fletcher station, I woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of something massive moving through the forest around the Ridgeline station. I woke from a dreamless sleep to complete darkness and perfect silence. For a moment I lay still, unsure what had woken me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps moving through the trees outside. Not the 4-footed gait of a deer or bear, but something that walked on 2 legs. Something big. The footfalls were slow and deliberate, and they circled the station at a distance of perhaps 30 yards. I could hear branches snapping under its weight. I could hear the undergrowth rustling as it passed. I got out of bed slowly and moved to the window. The forest outside was dark. My eyes had not adjusted, and I could see almost nothing. I stood there in the darkness, listening as whatever it was completed its circuit of the building and then moved away, crashing through the underbrush as it descended into the valley. The sounds faded. Silence returned. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the main room with all the lights on and my service pistol on the table in front of me. I felt ridiculous, but I could not shake the fear. Something had been out there, something large enough to make the ground shake with each step. Something that had come right up to the station and circled it as if checking, as if making sure I was inside. When dawn came, I went outside to look for tracks. I found them easily. They were not animal prints. They were not human prints. They were something in between, broad and elongated with what looked like 5 distinct toe impressions and the suggestion of a heel. Each print was roughly 18 inches long and pressed deep into the soft earth. The stride length was enormous, nearly 6 feet between each impression. I measured everything carefully. I took photographs. I tried to tell myself there was a logical explanation, a person in costume, a hoax, but the depth of the prints suggested something far heavier than any human. I followed the trail of prints down into the valley. They led through dense forest where the undergrowth was thick with ferns and fallen logs. Whatever had made these prints had simply walked through obstacles that should have forced it to go around. Small trees were pushed aside or broken. A rotting log 3 feet in diameter had a massive footprint pressed into its surface where the thing had simply stepped on it and kept going. I followed the trail for over a mile until it reached a stream and vanished into the water. I could not find where it emerged on the other side. I stood there at the edge of that stream and felt the forest pressing in around me. The air was thick and humid. Mist hung in the low places. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I had the overpowering sense that I was being observed from somewhere just out of sight, that eyes were on me from the shadows beneath the trees. I turned and walked back to the station, and I did not look behind me, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. That afternoon, I drove into town and went to the public library. If the Park Service was not going to take this seriously, then I would find my own answers. I spent hours going through local newspaper archives searching for any references to strange occurrences in Thornwood. What I found was a history of unease stretching back to before the land was designated as a national forest. The earliest accounts came from the journals of settlers in the 1880s. A farmer named Josiah Fletcher, for whom the abandoned ranger station was presumably named, had written extensive accounts of something he called the walker that moved through the old-growth forests at night. His entries were detailed and consistent. He described a creature that stood upright like a man, but was far larger, covered in dark hair, with eyes that reflected firelight like an animal. He claimed it killed his livestock and left massive footprints around his property. He said it watched his family from the edge of the forest, and that its presence filled him with a terror unlike anything he had experienced in the war. The local sheriff at the time dismissed Fletcher as a drunk and a storyteller, but other settlers made similar reports. In 1889, a logging crew working in what was now the northern section of the park abandoned their camp after several workers claimed to have seen a huge figure moving through the trees at dawn. In 1903, a group of railroad surveyors working through the area reported finding a crude shelter built from broken trees and filled with animal bones. In 1912, a young man hunting deer vanished in the forest and was found 3 days later clinging to life in a hollow tree. He claimed something had chased him through the woods for hours. He died the next day from exposure, and his final words, according to the doctor who treated him, were warnings never to enter those woods alone. The stories continued through the decades. As the area became state forest and then federal land, as tourism increased and the Park Service established itself, the reports did not stop. They just became more official, more sanitized, logged as missing persons cases and unexplained disappearances, filed away and forgotten. But the pattern remained. Every few years, someone vanished. Every few years, there were reports of something in the forest that should not be there. I made copies of everything I could find. I drove back to the station with a box of documents and a growing sense that I was in over my head. The sensible thing to do would be to request a transfer, to leave Thornwood and let someone else deal with whatever was happening here. But I kept thinking about Sarah, about her boots sitting on that rock, about her bracelet in that circle of bones. Someone needed to care about what happened to her. Someone needed to ask the hard questions, even if the answers were impossible. I spent the next week conducting what I told myself was a survey of park conditions, but was really a search for evidence of the creature. I hiked every major trail. I checked on the remote areas where hikers rarely ventured. I visited the sites where people had vanished over the years. What I found was consistent and disturbing. The trees bore those deep claw marks in multiple locations. The forest floor in certain areas was compressed and worn as if from regular heavy traffic along specific routes. I found more collections of bones and debris, always in remote places, always arranged with deliberate care. Near the old Mackenzie fire tower, I found a tree that had been partially stripped of its bark. The exposed wood underneath scored with what looked like territorial markings, deep gouges arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. I set up trail cameras at several locations. Cameras were cheap now and effective in low light. If something was moving through these woods, I wanted footage. I positioned them carefully along game trails and near water sources and at the edges of clearings. I checked them every few days. Most of the footage was exactly what I expected. Deer moving through at dusk. Raccoons investigating the camera at night. Once a black bear ambling past in the early morning, but one camera, the one I had placed near a spring about 3 miles from the Fletcher station, captured something else. The footage was from 2 a.m. on a moonless night. The infrared gave everything a ghostly gray-green cast. For the first few seconds of the clip there was nothing, just the spring and the trees beyond it rendered in shades of gray. Then movement at the edge of the frame. Something enormous emerged from behind a tree. It moved into view slowly, cautiously, as if aware of the camera. For 3 seconds it stood there and I could see it clearly. It was massive, perhaps 9 feet tall, with a broad, hunched posture and long arms that reached nearly to its knees. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair. The face was partly visible in profile, more ape than human but not quite either, with a pronounced brow ridge and a large jaw. Then it turned and looked directly at the camera and I felt my breath catch. The eyes reflected the infrared in bright white circles. There was intelligence there. Awareness. It knew what the camera was. It stared for perhaps 2 seconds, and then it moved out of frame with shocking speed, and the video ended. I watched that clip 50 times. I analyzed every frame. There was no possibility of fakery. This was not a person in a suit. The proportions were wrong. The movement was wrong. The sheer size of it was beyond anything human. I had captured proof. Proof that something massive and intelligent lived in these woods. Proof that might explain what had happened to Sarah and all the others. I should have taken that footage straight to the authorities. I should have called in wildlife experts and demanded a full investigation. Instead, I sat in my small office at the Ridgeline station and stared at that paused frame, at those intelligent eyes looking back at me, and I felt a deep primal fear that went beyond anything I had experienced before. This was not an animal. This was something else. Something that had been here long before the Park Service, long before the settlers, long before any human claim to these mountains. Something that considered this territory its own, and I had been documenting it, tracking it, invading its space with my cameras and my curiosity. I had made myself a target. That night, the knocking returned. It started just after dark, 3 deep, resonant knocks from somewhere in the valley below the station. Then silence. Then 3 more knocks from a different location, closer now. I turned off all the lights and watched from the window as the sounds moved through the forest, circling, drawing nearer with each repetition. Whatever was out there was announcing itself, warning me, or perhaps calling to others of its kind. The knocks continued for nearly an hour before they finally stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I did not sleep. I sat in the darkness with my pistol in my lap and waited for dawn. When morning finally came, I made a decision. I would hike to the Fletcher station one more time. I would bring enough supplies to stay there for several days if needed. I would set up cameras covering all approaches, and I would wait. If this creature was territorial, if it was drawn to that location, then perhaps I could capture more footage. Perhaps I could find proof that even the Park Service could not ignore. Perhaps I could force them to take action. It was a stupid plan born of sleep deprivation and fear and stubbornness, but it was the only plan I had. I loaded my pack with food, water, extra batteries, and 4 additional trail cameras. I informed the regional office via email that I would be conducting a multi-day survey of the Northwest Quadrant. I told no one the real reason I was going. I set out early on a Wednesday morning in late July. The weather was clear and hot, and the forest was as silent as ever. I made good time on the maintained trails, but once I turned off onto the overgrown path that led to the Fletcher station, my pace slowed. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threat. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me tense. I stopped frequently to listen, but heard nothing unusual. I reached the clearing by early afternoon. The station looked exactly as I had left it weeks ago. The door still hung open. The porch still sagged under its own weight. I moved carefully, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing. I entered the building and was hit by the smell, stronger now in the summer heat. That organic rot smell that made my eyes water. The circle of bones was still in the center of the main room, but it had been added to. There were more items now. A leather wallet, a child's shoe, a hunting knife, a torn piece of flannel shirt. None of these things had been here before. Something was still coming here, still adding to its collection. I set up my sleeping area in one of the back rooms where I would have walls on 3 sides and a view of both the main entrance and a window facing the clearing. I placed cameras at the 4 cardinal points around the station, positioning them to cover all approaches. I settled in to wait. The first day passed without incident. I sat in that musty room watching the light change as afternoon became evening, became night. I ate cold food from cans and drank water and listened to the absolute silence of the forest. No birds, no insects, the kind of quiet that feels like pressure against your eardrums. Night brought darkness so complete I could not see my hand in front of my face without my flashlight. I sat with my back against the wall and tried to stay alert. Sometime around midnight, I heard the footsteps. They were distant at first, moving through the forest with that same heavy, deliberate rhythm I had heard outside the Ridgeline station. I listened as they drew closer. They circled the clearing once, staying just inside the tree line where I could not see. Then they stopped. Silence for perhaps 10 minutes. Then 3 knocks, so loud and close they made me flinch. They came from directly behind the station. I waited. Nothing. I finally allowed myself to breathe again, and that was when I heard it move onto the porch. The boards creaked under enormous weight. I heard something scrape against the doorframe. I heard breathing, deep and slow, just outside the doorway to the main room. I sat frozen with my pistol in my hand and my flashlight off, and my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Whatever was out there stayed for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. I could hear it shifting its weight. I could hear it testing the floorboards. Then it moved back outside, and the footsteps retreated into the forest and were gone. I did not move until dawn. When gray light finally began to filter through the dirty windows, I stood on shaking legs and made my way to the main room. The door was open wider than before. In the dust on the floor were massive handprints, 4 clear impressions where something had braced itself while looking inside. Each print showed 5 fingers, elongated and tipped with what looked like claw marks. I checked the cameras with trembling hands. 3 of the 4 had been destroyed, knocked from their positions and smashed against trees. The 4th had captured several frames of movement, but nothing clear, just blurred images of something massive moving past in the darkness. I packed my gear and left the Fletcher station within an hour. I did not run, but I walked fast, constantly checking behind me. The forest remained silent. Nothing followed me that I could see, but I could feel it out there, watching, making sure I left. When I reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back and drove away, and I did not stop until I was back at the Ridgeline station with the doors locked and the lights on. I stayed inside for 2 days. I called in sick, the first time I had taken a sick day in 5 years. I told myself I was processing what I had experienced. The truth was, I was terrified. I had seen evidence now that could not be explained away. I had been within yards of something that should not exist according to everything I had been taught about wildlife and nature. I had felt its presence, heard its breathing, seen the marks it left behind, and I understood with cold clarity that it had allowed me to leave. It could have come through that doorway. It could have ended my life as easily as it had presumably ended Sarah's and all the others. But it had not. It had simply made sure I knew it was there. It had warned me off its territory. The question was, what I did now with that knowledge. I could go public. I could release the footage I had captured and the photographs of the prints and the claw marks. I could tell the media everything I knew about the disappearances and the patterns stretching back decades. But I knew what would happen. I would be labeled a crank, a hoaxer, someone who had spent too much time alone in the woods and cracked under the pressure. The footage would be dismissed as a man in a suit. The prints would be called fakes. The disappearances would remain officially unsolved, but unofficially attributed to accidents and poor judgment. No one wanted to believe that something like this existed. No one wanted to accept that there were still dark places in the world where humans were not the apex predator. The alternative was to say nothing, to put in for a transfer and leave Thornwood behind, to let the forest keep its secrets and hope that the thing in the woods would return to whatever cycle of behavior had kept it hidden for so long. But that meant abandoning Sarah and all the others. It meant knowing people would continue to hike these trails and that some of them would not return. It meant living with the knowledge that I had failed in the most fundamental duty of a ranger, which is to protect people in my care. I spent those 2 days in a haze of indecision and fear. On the third day, the decision was made for me. I received a radio call from a day hiker who had found a body on the Widow's Creek Trail in almost the exact location where Sarah's camera had been discovered. I drove to the trailhead and hiked in with 2 rangers from the Southern District. We found the body lying in the middle of the trail, covered with branches and leaves in a deliberate attempt at concealment. It was not Sarah. It was a man, middle-aged, wearing hiking gear. He had been dead for perhaps 2 weeks based on the state of decomposition. There were massive injuries to his torso and neck. The medical examiner would later rule the death was caused by a large predatory animal, but would note that the specific pattern of injuries was inconsistent with known bear or mountain lion behavior. What struck me most was his face. His eyes were open, and even in death they held an expression of absolute terror. Whatever he had seen in his final moments had been beyond comprehension. We searched the area and found his pack 50 yards from the body, torn open and scattered. His wallet identified him as Robert Sykes from California, 46 years old, married with 3 children. He had signed in at the trailhead 6 days ago and had been reported missing by his wife when he failed to return. Another disappearance that had slipped through the cracks. Another person who had encountered something in these woods and paid the ultimate price. I helped load the body onto the stretcher, and I hiked out with the others, and I filed the required paperwork. That night I made my decision. I could not leave. I could not transfer away and pretend I did not know what was out there. I had to do something, even if that something was futile. I began a systematic campaign of documentation. Every night I reviewed old files and cross-referenced them with my own observations. I compiled a database of every disappearance, every strange report, every piece of physical evidence I had collected. I organized the photographs and video footage. I wrote detailed accounts of everything I had experienced. I created a comprehensive file that laid out the pattern and the evidence in terms that could not be easily dismissed. I stored copies of everything in multiple locations. I sent an encrypted file to a friend who worked as a journalist in Seattle. I left detailed instructions that if anything happened to me, the information should be released to the public. It was a form of insurance and perhaps also a death wish. Because I knew that by compiling this evidence, by refusing to let it go, I was painting a target on my back. The creature had warned me once. It had let me leave the Fletcher station alive. It would not be so generous a second time. The weeks that followed were tense and strange. I continued my regular duties, but I did so with constant awareness of the forest around me. I never hiked alone without my pistol. I never went anywhere remote without telling someone exactly where I would be and when I would return. I checked my trail cameras religiously. Most showed nothing unusual, but occasionally I would find one smashed or missing entirely. Twice more I found footage of the creature, always at night, always distant, moving through the forest with that same purposeful gait. It was following me. I understood that now, just as it had stalked Sarah and Robert Sykes and all the others. It was tracking me, learning my patterns, waiting for the right moment. I began sleeping poorly. I would wake at night convinced I heard footsteps outside my cabin in town or breathing beneath my window. I started keeping the lights on constantly. My neighbors probably thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. In mid-August, a family reported that their teenage son had become separated from them on a day hike near Deadfall Curve. A search was organized immediately. I joined the effort along with a dozen other rangers and volunteers. We found the boy within 6 hours, alive and unharmed, sitting on a fallen log 2 miles from where he had last been seen. He was in shock. He would not speak for the first hour except to say over and over that he had seen something. When he finally calmed down enough to give a coherent statement, he described hiding in a hollow tree while something massive walked past him. He said it had been looking for him, moving back and forth through the area, and that he had stayed absolutely still and quiet until it moved on. He said it walked on 2 legs like a man, but was huge and covered in dark hair and smelled like death. His parents took him home. The official report stated he had become disoriented and frightened. No mention was made of what he claimed to have seen. But I knew he was telling the truth. I recognized the look in his eyes, that same terrible understanding that something impossible and ancient was out there in the forest. The boy had been lucky. He had hidden and stayed silent, and the creature had moved on. But his luck would not hold forever for anyone who hiked these woods. None of our luck would. I started having a recurring dream. In the dream, I was hiking through Thornwood at dusk, and I knew something was following me, but I could not see it. I could hear its footsteps behind me, heavy and slow, matching my pace exactly. If I sped up, it sped up. If I stopped, it stopped. The dream always ended the same way. I would turn around to finally confront whatever was following me, and I would see it standing there in the trail perhaps 20 feet away, 9 feet tall, hunched and massive, eyes reflecting what little light remained. And in the dream I understood that it had been following me not to hunt me, but to show me something. It would extend one long arm and point toward the forest, and I would look in that direction and see dozens of bodies hanging from the trees, wrapped in vines and slowly decaying. Sarah and Robert and Thomas Webb and all the others. The creature's collection, its territory marked with death. I would wake from that dream gasping and covered in sweat. I tried to convince myself that I was just stressed, that the dream meant nothing, but I could not shake the feeling that it was more than a dream, that it was a message, that the creature wanted me to know what I was dealing with. In late August, I received a call from my supervisor, Gerald Hutchins. He was coming to Thornwood for an inspection. He wanted to review operations and discuss several concerns that had been raised about inconsistencies in my reports. I knew what that meant. Someone had noticed I was asking too many questions. Someone had looked at my pattern of behavior over the past months and decided I needed to be reined in or removed. Gerald arrived on a Thursday afternoon. He was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the soft hands of someone who spent his life behind a desk. We did a cursory inspection of the Ridgeline station, and then he suggested we take a walk to discuss things privately. We hiked a short distance down a maintained trail, and then Gerald stopped and turned to face me. He asked me directly if I was all right, if the job was becoming too much, if I needed to take an extended leave. I told him I was fine. He looked at me with something like pity and said he had read my reports. He said he understood I was troubled by the disappearances, but that I needed to accept that these things happened in wild places. People made mistakes. People got lost. People died. It was tragic, but it was part of working in wilderness management. I asked him about the pattern, about the fact that 17 people had vanished in Thornwood over 40 years under similar circumstances. He sighed and said that was not actually unusual for a park of this size, that most national forests had comparable numbers, that I was seeing connections where none existed. I asked him about the physical evidence, the claw marks, the footprints, the footage I had captured. He looked uncomfortable then. He said he had seen the photos I had submitted and that they were interesting but hardly conclusive, that the scientific community would require far more substantial evidence before taking claims about unknown species seriously, that my responsibility was to the living visitors to the park, not to chase what was almost certainly nothing more than misidentification and coincidence. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said that if I continued down this path, I would be removed from my position. That the Park Service could not have rangers spreading rumors about monsters in the forest, that it was bad for tourism and bad for my career and bad for everyone involved. He said this gently, almost kindly, but the threat was clear. I nodded. I told him I understood. I said I would refocus on my regular duties and stop pursuing these investigations. He seemed relieved. He clapped me on the shoulder and said he was glad to hear it. We hiked back to the station, and he left that afternoon, and I watched his car disappear down the access road, and I knew that I had just lied to my supervisor for the first time in my career. Because I was not going to stop. I could not stop. Too many people were dead. Too many questions remained unanswered, and I had seen that creature with my own eyes, captured it on video, documented its existence in ways that should matter. If the Park Service would not act, then I would have to find another way. I spent the next 2 weeks making preparations. I gathered supplies and equipment. I studied everything I had learned about the creature's behavior. I identified the areas where it seemed to spend most of its time, the routes it used to move through the forest, the locations where it had been most active. I formulated a plan that was equal parts research expedition and suicide mission. I would hike deep into the northwest quadrant of Thornwood, into the most remote and rugged terrain, and I would find the creature's territory. I would document everything I could, and I would stream the footage live to secure cloud storage so that even if something happened to me, the evidence would survive. It was insane. I knew it was insane, but I could not live with the alternative, which was to walk away and pretend that everything was normal. I informed the regional office that I would be taking a week of vacation. I told my few friends in town that I was going to visit family. I prepared my gear, and I wrote letters to be delivered if I did not return. One to my sister explaining where I had gone and why. One to the journalist in Seattle authorizing him to release all the evidence I had compiled. One to Sarah's parents apologizing for failing to find answers sooner. I sealed those letters and left them with my attorney with instructions to mail them if I did not check in within 10 days. On a Wednesday morning in early September, I drove to a remote trailhead at the far northwestern edge of the park. I shouldered my pack, and I activated the live streaming cameras I had rigged to my gear, and I walked into the forest. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled like rain. The trees closed around me, and the modern world fell away. I was entering territory that humans had never truly controlled, no matter how many trails we cut or maps we drew. I was walking into a darkness that had existed long before me and would continue long after I was gone. The first day I hiked hard, covering nearly 12 miles through increasingly difficult terrain. I passed beyond the maintained trails and followed game paths and compass bearings into country I had never visited. The forest here was old, cathedral quiet, the trees massive and spaced far apart. Ferns covered the ground in thick green carpets. Fallen logs the size of cars slowly dissolved back into the earth. I saw no animals. I heard no birds. The silence was profound. I made camp that evening in a small clearing beside a creek. I set up my tent and ate a cold dinner, and I sat in the gathering darkness listening to the water move over stones. Nothing disturbed me that night, but I slept poorly, waking at every small sound, convinced each time that something massive was approaching through the trees. The second day took me deeper. I climbed through a series of steep ravines and over a ridge that gave me views of miles of untouched forest stretching in every direction. I was truly remote now, farther from help than I had ever been. If something happened to me here, it would be days before anyone even noticed I was missing, and weeks before anyone found my body, if they ever did. I found the first real sign of the creature late that afternoon. A massive tree had been stripped of its bark in a spiral pattern that ran from ground level to 20 feet up. The exposed wood underneath was scored with deep parallel gouges. This was a boundary marker, I realized, a claim of territory. I was getting close. I made camp early that evening in a location that gave me good visibility in all directions. I positioned my cameras to cover every approach. I built a small fire, something I normally would not have done in these conditions, but I wanted light, and I wanted the creature to know I was here. If it was going to come for me, I wanted it to happen on my terms. I sat beside that fire as night fell, and I thought about all the decisions that had led me to this moment. Every choice I could have made differently. Every point where I could have walked away. But I had not walked away. And now here I was, sitting alone in the deepest wilderness of Thornwood, waiting for a creature that should not exist to emerge from the darkness and show itself. The knocking started around 10 p.m. 3 deep, booming knocks from somewhere to the north. Then silence. Then 3 more from the east. Then the south. Then the west. It was circling me, announcing its presence, letting me know I was surrounded. I stood and moved away from the fire so my eyes could adjust to the darkness. I activated all my cameras and made sure they were streaming properly. Whatever happened next would be recorded. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a void of sound that pressed against my eardrums. Then I heard the footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the forest toward my position. I waited. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 40 yards away. I shined my flashlight in that direction and saw nothing but trees and darkness. I called out. I said I was not here to hurt it. I said I only wanted to understand. My voice sounded small and pathetic in that vast silence. No response. Then a sound I had not heard before. A vocalization, deep and resonant, somewhere between a growl and a roar, but with an articulation that suggested language. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds, and it raised every hair on my body. It was not trying to scare me, it was trying to communicate. I called out again. I said I wanted to talk. I said I knew it was intelligent. I said I knew it had been here long before humans arrived. Another vocalization, different this time, shorter and sharper. Then the sound of something massive moving through the underbrush off to my right. I spun and caught a glimpse of it in my flashlight beam, 9 feet tall, covered in dark matted hair, moving between trees with fluid grace despite its size. Then it was gone, vanished into the shadows. My heart was hammering. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay still. Running was what prey did. I was not prey. I was here as an observer, a witness. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The forest remained silent. Then from behind me came the sound of breathing, deep and slow, very close. I turned slowly, afraid of what I would see. It was standing at the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my firelight. I could see its outline, massive and hunched. Could see its eyes reflecting my flashlight in bright amber circles. We looked at each other across 30 feet of darkness, and I felt something pass between us. Recognition, understanding. It knew I was not a threat. It knew I was here to document, not to harm. And it was choosing to let me see it, to let me bear witness to its existence. I raised my camera slowly. The creature did not move. I took photographs. I kept my movements slow and deliberate. I spoke softly, thanking it, telling it I understood the weight of what it was showing me. It stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it turned and walked into the forest, and the darkness swallowed it, and it was gone. I stood in that clearing, shaking, not from fear, but from awe and a profound sense of privilege. I had seen it, really seen it, and it had allowed me that sight. I had my proof now. Video and photographs captured from mere yards away. Evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. Evidence that would force the world to acknowledge that something ancient and intelligent still lived in these forests. I should have left then. I should have packed my gear and hiked out immediately while I still could, but I did not. Because I understood now that this was not just about proof. It was about something deeper, about respecting a creature that had every reason to kill me, but had chosen not to, about honoring the trust it had shown by revealing itself. I sat by my fire until dawn. The creature did not return, but I could feel its presence in the forest around me, watching, waiting. When morning came, I broke camp and I began the long hike back toward civilization. I walked slowly, respectfully, stopping often to listen to the forest. I saw no further sign of the creature, but twice I heard knocking in the distance, that same pattern of 3, acknowledgement perhaps that I was leaving its territory. I made it back to my truck by late afternoon of the 3rd day. I was exhausted and filthy, and my supplies were depleted, but I was alive, and I had what I had come for. I drove back to town, and I went directly to my apartment, and I reviewed all the footage and photographs I had captured. They were clear, undeniable. The creature standing at the edge of the clearing, visible in the firelight and the camera flash, its face partly visible, that strange blend of ape and human features, its eyes looking directly at the camera with unmistakable intelligence. I had done it. I had proof. I spent that evening organizing everything and preparing to release it all to the world. The photographs, the video, the complete file of evidence I had compiled over the months. Tomorrow I would send it to major news outlets. I would contact wildlife researchers. I would force the world to acknowledge what I had found. But as I sat there looking at that image of the creature, at those intelligent eyes staring back at me, I felt a growing uncertainty. What would happen when this went public? There would be an immediate rush of interest. Researchers and thrill seekers and hunters would flood into Thornwood. The creature's territory would be invaded. Its ancient, peaceful existence would be shattered. And what then? Would it be captured, killed, made into a spectacle? I had spent months terrified of this being, had seen it as a threat and a monster. But sitting there looking at the evidence I had gathered, I saw something else. I saw a creature that had lived hidden in these forests for perhaps thousands of years. A creature that had survived by avoiding humans, by taking only occasionally what it needed. by maintaining a balance that we would never understand. Yes, people had died. Sarah and Robert and Thomas and all the others. That was terrible and tragic. But they had entered its territory. They had ventured into places that had never truly been ours. In any wilderness, there are dangers. There are predators and hazards and the risk of death. We accept that when we step off the pavement and into the wild, this creature was part of that wilderness. Removing it or exposing it would not make Thornwood safer. It would only destroy something rare and ancient and irreplaceable. I sat there until very late, struggling with this decision. The responsible thing, the thing any rational person would do, was to release the evidence and let the proper authorities handle it. But I had seen the Park Service response. I knew what would happen. There would be a hunt. There would be media circus. There would be an end to something that had existed since before any of us were born. In the early hours of morning, I made my choice. I deleted everything. The photographs, the video, the streaming footage, all the evidence I had risked my life to capture. I erased it systematically and thoroughly, wiping the drives and destroying the memory cards. I kept only my written notes, my personal documentation of what I had experienced. That would be enough for me. The world did not need to know. Some things should remain hidden. Some mysteries should stay unsolved. The next morning, I drove back to the Ridgeline station and I filed a report stating that my vacation time had been restful and that I was ready to return to regular duties. I told no one what I had done or what I had seen. Life at Thornwood returned to what passed for normal. Hikers came and went. Rangers patrolled the trails. The forest continued its ancient cycles. I continued my work and I watched carefully for any signs that the creature was active, but the rest of that fall was quiet. No disappearances, no strange reports. The knocking sounds that had been common in the summer faded away. It was as if the creature had retreated deep into its territory, satisfied that the threat I represented was gone. I think about Sarah often, about her parents who never got answers, about all the families who lost people to these woods. I carry that weight, and I always will. But I believe I made the right choice. Some things are bigger than individual justice. Some things matter more than closure. In November, I requested and received approval for a new position at a different national forest 3 states away. I told people I needed a change of scenery. The truth was, I could not stay at Thornwood anymore. Not because I was afraid, though I was, but because I had become something I had not anticipated. I had become a keeper of secrets, a guardian of mysteries, and that was not a role I could sustain in a place where I was expected to tell the full truth about conditions and hazards. My last day at Thornwood was in early December. Snow had begun to fall in the high country, and the forest had that hushed quality that comes with winter. I hiked out to the Fletcher station one final time. The structure looked even more decrepit than before, halfway to falling down, soon to be fully reclaimed by the forest. I went inside. The circle of bones was still there in the main room, but it had been rearranged. The human objects were gone, removed, or perhaps taken elsewhere. Only the small bones remained, arranged now in a spiral pattern that reminded me of the bark stripped from that tree. A message, perhaps, or simply art. I stood there for a long time, and then I spoke aloud. I said I was leaving. I said I was sorry for intruding. I said I hoped it could return to its peace and that others would respect its territory even if they did not know why. I do not know if it heard me. I do not know if it understood. But as I turned to leave, I heard a single knock from somewhere in the forest outside. Acknowledgement. Farewell. I walked away from the Fletcher station, and I did not look back. I hiked out of Thornwood that afternoon, and I have never returned. I work now in a different forest, in a different state, and I do my job well. I help hikers and maintain trails, and I sleep soundly most nights. But sometimes, usually in the deep hours before dawn, I wake to perfect silence, and I remember what it felt like to stand in that clearing and see those amber eyes looking back at me from the darkness. I remember the weight of that moment, the privilege and the terror of it. And I wonder if I will ever experience anything like that again, or if that was the singular defining moment of my life, the point where everything changed and could never change back. People still disappear in Thornwood. I check the news sometimes and I see the reports. A hiker here, a hunter there. The official explanations are always the same. Accidents, exposure, poor judgment. The forest keeps its secrets and the creature continues its ancient existence, and the world goes on not knowing what lives in those deep woods. I think about writing this down sometimes, creating a record of what really happened. But what would be the point? No one would believe it. And even if they did, what good would come from that knowledge? Better to let the mystery remain. Better to let people walk those trails in blissful ignorance than in paralyzing fear. But I will say this. If you ever find yourself hiking alone in deep forest and you feel suddenly that you are being watched, trust that instinct. If you hear knocking sounds echoing through the trees in patterns of 3, turn back. If you come across a trail that feels wrong in a way you cannot explain, choose a different path. If you see massive prints in the mud or claw marks scored deep into tree bark, or a clearing where the birds do not sing, leave immediately and do not return. There are places in this world that humans were never meant to claim fully. There are beings older and stranger than we can comprehend. They allow us to pass through their domain most of the time, but they are not bound by our rules or our understanding. They are the true owners of the wild places. And sometimes, rarely but inevitably, they remind us of that fact. I learned that lesson at Thornwood. I learned it at great cost, and I carry it with me every day. The forest is not empty. It has never been empty. And what lives there, patient and ancient and utterly beyond our control, is watching still. The radio crackled at 3:15 Tuesday afternoon, Teresa's voice tight with urgency. "Troy, you copy? We've got missing hikers." I froze on the muddy trail, snow melt soaking my boots. The cold seeped through the worn leather, but it was nothing compared to the chill that ran down my spine at those words. Guided group. 3 days overdue. 3 days meant hope was already slipping away. In these mountains, 3 days could mean the difference between a rescue and a recovery. I had seen it too many times in my 19 years patrolling Mount Rainier National Park. Last location, Wonderland Trail near Mowich Lake. My stomach dropped. Mowich Lake. Of all the places in this park, it had to be there. I pressed the radio button, my thumb trembling slightly. "Copy that, Teresa." "How many in the group?" 7 total, 6 hikers plus their guide. The guide is Chester Millwood. I knew Chester. Everyone in the ranger station knew Chester. He had been leading groups through these trails for over 30 years. If Chester was missing, something had gone terribly wrong. Chester knew every rock, every stream, every hidden danger in these woods. He knew when to turn back. He knew when to seek shelter. He knew the mountain's moods better than anyone alive. Then she added, "We intercepted an emergency transmission last night." I waited, the forest around me suddenly too quiet. Even the birds had stopped their afternoon songs. It was broken up, mostly static, but we caught a few words. Teresa paused, and I could hear her swallow hard even through the radio static. She said, "They kept repeating something about the trees watching them." And then someone screamed, and the transmission cut out. I stood there in the middle of the trail, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that suddenly seemed closer than before. The afternoon light was fading faster than it should, the shadows between the trees growing longer, darker, hungrier. I had worked in these forests long enough to know that fear was a luxury a ranger could not afford. But standing there, with Teresa's words echoing in my mind, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt afraid. I made it back to the ranger station within the hour, my legs burning from the pace I had set. The station was a modest wooden building nestled at the edge of the wilderness, a thin line between civilization and the vast unknown that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. When I pushed through the door, I found Teresa hunched over the radio equipment, her graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She looked up when I entered, and I could see the worry etched deep in the lines of her face. Teresa had been working dispatch for 23 years. She had heard things over that radio that would keep most people awake for the rest of their lives, but I had never seen her look like this. She looked haunted. "Troy, thank God." I pulled up a chair beside her and sat down heavily, my wet boots leaving muddy prints on the floor. "Tell me everything." She took a deep breath and consulted her notes, written in her neat, precise handwriting on a yellow legal pad. The group registered at the Mowich Lake trailhead last Friday morning. 7 people total, Chester Millwood as the guide. The hikers were Harold and Edna Patterson, a retired couple from Portland. Walter Fleming, a school teacher from Tacoma. Dorothy Shaw, a nature photographer, and 2 brothers, Earl and Clarence Whitmore, both in their early 30s. They were supposed to complete a 4-day loop and return Monday evening. When they did not check in, we started trying to reach them by radio. Nothing. We sent a preliminary search team yesterday morning, but they came back before nightfall. They said they could not find any trace of the group past the first campsite. I frowned. That does not make sense. Chester always follows the established route. He is religious about it. Teresa nodded slowly. That is what I thought too, but it gets stranger. She reached over and pressed a button on the radio equipment. I want you to hear this yourself. The speakers crackled to life, and at first all I could hear was static, that familiar white noise that filled the gaps between transmissions. But then, underneath the static, I heard something else. A voice. It was faint, distorted, barely recognizable as human. But it was definitely a voice. I leaned closer, straining to make out the words. This is Millwood. Emergency. Something is wrong. The trees. They are watching. We tried to leave, but the trail. It keeps. I heard another voice in the background, higher pitched, panicked, and then the scream. It was not a scream of surprise or even pain. It was a scream of pure, primal terror. The kind of sound a human being makes when they are confronted with something their mind cannot process. The transmission cut out abruptly, leaving only static. Teresa turned off the recording and we sat in silence for a long moment. When did this come in? I asked finally. Last night, around 2 a.m. I tried to respond, tried to establish contact, but there was nothing, just dead air. I ran my hand through my hair, trying to process what I had just heard. Chester Millwood was one of the most level-headed men I had ever known. In 30 years of guiding, he had faced bears, mountain lions, flash floods, and hypothermic conditions. I had never heard fear in his voice, until now. We need to mount a full search and rescue operation, I said. First light tomorrow. I want every available ranger, and we need to contact County Search and Rescue for additional support. Teresa was already nodding, reaching for the phone. I will make the calls. But Troy, there is something else you should know. I waited. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the receiver. Before the transmission from Chester, we picked up something else. Another signal, very faint, on a frequency we do not normally monitor. What kind of signal? I do not know how to describe it. It was not voices, not exactly. It was more like sounds, rhythmic sounds, almost like breathing, but not quite. And underneath that, something that sounded like whispers, but not in any language I have ever heard. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. How long did it last? About 20 minutes. It started around 1:30 a.m. and faded out just before Chester's transmission came through. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to chalk it up to atmospheric interference, crossed signals from some distant radio station, anything that would make rational sense. But something in Teresa's eyes told me she had already considered all those explanations and rejected them. I need you to keep that recording, I said. Both recordings. Do not let anyone else hear them until I get back. She nodded, understanding without me having to explain. In a situation like this, panic was our greatest enemy. If word got out that something strange was happening on the mountain, we would have media crews and amateur investigators flooding the area, contaminating potential evidence, putting themselves in danger. And if there was something out there, something that had made Chester Millwood scream like that, the last thing we needed was more potential victims. I spent the rest of the evening preparing for the search. I checked my gear 3 times, making sure I had everything I might need for an extended operation. First aid kit, emergency blankets, flares, extra batteries for my flashlight and radio, water purification tablets, energy bars, a detailed topographic map of the Moich Lake area, and my service weapon. I had carried that pistol for 19 years and had only drawn it twice, both times for bear encounters that ended without incident. But something told me this time might be different. As I packed, I found my mind wandering back to the stories I had heard over the years. Every national park has its legends, its unexplained incidents, its cases that were never quite solved. Mount Rainier was no exception. There were the hikers who vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but their abandoned tents. There were the campers who reported seeing lights in the forest at night, moving between the trees with purpose and intelligence. There were the hunters who came back from the deep woods changed, refusing to speak about what they had seen, their eyes carrying a haunted look that never quite faded. And then there were the older stories, the ones that predated the park itself. The Native American tribes who had lived in the shadow of the mountain for thousands of years had their own names for the places we now marked on tourist maps. They had their own warnings about certain valleys, certain groves, certain stretches of trail where the spirits were not friendly to human visitors. Most rangers dismissed these stories as folklore, as quaint legends to be shared around campfires for entertainment. But I had been in these woods long enough to know that not all stories were fiction. Some stories were warnings, and the wise man heeded them. I slept poorly that night, my dreams filled with dark trees and distant screams. When my alarm went off at 4:30 a.m., I was already awake, staring at the ceiling of my small cabin, listening to the wind whisper through the pines outside my window. I got dressed in the darkness, my movements automatic after years of early morning patrols. By the time I reached the ranger station, the sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading one by one as dawn approached. The parking lot was already full of vehicles. I counted 3 ranger trucks, 2 county search and rescue vans, and a handful of private cars belonging to volunteer searchers. Teresa had done her job well. Inside, the station was a hive of activity. I found Teresa coordinating with the search teams, assigning sectors, distributing maps and radio frequencies. Standing beside her was a man I recognized immediately, even though I had not seen him in years. His name was Eugene Haskell, and he was the most experienced tracker in the Pacific Northwest. He had retired from the Park Service a decade ago, but he still lived in a small cabin at the edge of the wilderness, and he still answered the call when things got serious. Eugene was in his 70s now, his hair white as snow, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind, but his eyes were still sharp, still carried that intense focus that had made him legendary among search and rescue teams. He nodded when he saw me, his expression grave. "Troy, bad business this, the worst." I walked over and shook his hand. "I appreciate you coming, Eugene. We are going to need your skills on this one." He grunted. Heard the recording. Teresa played it for me. I had never seen fear in Chester's voice before. Now it was Eugene's turn to look unsettled. Neither had I. We gathered the search teams in the main room of the station for a briefing. There were 18 of us in total, a mix of rangers, search and rescue volunteers, and a few experienced locals who knew the mountain well. I stood at the front of the room, a large map of the Wonderland Trail pinned to the wall behind me. "All right, everyone, listen up. We have 7 missing persons, including one of our most experienced guides. They were last confirmed at the Mowich Lake trailhead 5 days ago. Their planned route would have taken them counterclockwise along the Wonderland Trail, with overnight stops at designated campsites. Yesterday's preliminary search found evidence of their first campsite, but nothing beyond that." I pointed to the map, tracing the route with my finger. "We are going to divide into 3 teams. Team 1, led by myself, will take the primary route along the trail, starting from the last known campsite. Team 2, led by Ranger Hawkins, will sweep the northern approach, covering the areas off-trail that an experienced guide might use as alternates. Team 3, led by Eugene here, will focus on tracking, looking for any physical evidence of where the group might have gone." I paused, looking out at the assembled faces. Some were veterans, their expressions calm and professional. Others were newer, and I could see the nervous energy in their eyes. I need to be clear about something. This is a search and rescue operation, but it is also potentially a crime scene investigation. We do not know what happened to this group. Until we do, I want everyone to be cautious. Stay in contact with your team at all times. Do not wander off alone. Report anything unusual, no matter how insignificant it might seem, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. A hand went up near the back of the room. It was Margaret Chen, one of our newer rangers, barely 6 months on the job. What kind of unusual things should we be looking for? I hesitated, not wanting to alarm anyone, but knowing they deserved to be prepared. Anything that does not fit the normal patterns. Unusual markings on trees, strange sounds, evidence of wildlife behavior that seems off. And I glanced at Teresa, who gave me a small nod. There have been reports of unusual radio interference in the area. If your equipment starts acting up, note the time and location and report it immediately. The room was quiet. I could tell they wanted to ask more questions, but they also sensed that I was holding something back. Good people, all of them. They trusted me to tell them what they needed to know and to protect them from what they did not. I hoped I was worthy of that trust. We moved out at first light, the 3 teams fanning out across the wilderness in a coordinated search pattern. My team consisted of 5 people. Myself, Margaret Chen, 2 search and rescue volunteers named Thomas and Ruth, and a local man named Virgil who had hiked these trails since he was a boy. The morning air was cold and crisp, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes your breath come out in thick white clouds. The forest was quiet, too quiet, the usual morning chorus of birds conspicuously absent. We reached the first campsite within 2 hours. It was exactly where it should be, a small clearing beside a stream, with a fire ring made of stones and a flat area suitable for tents. But there was something wrong. I crouched down beside the fire ring, examining the remains of a campfire. The ashes were old, at least several days, which was consistent with the timeline, but scattered among the ashes were personal belongings that no camper would leave behind. A wristwatch, its crystal cracked. A pair of reading glasses, one lens missing. A paperback book, its pages warped and stained by moisture. And a single hiking boot, the laces still tied. I picked up the boot and turned it over in my hands. It was a man's boot, size 11, well worn but still serviceable. There was no reason for someone to leave behind a single boot, unless they had left in a hurry, unless they had not had time to put it back on. Troy, over here. It was Margaret, calling from the far edge of the clearing. I set down the boot and walked over to where she was standing, staring at something on the ground. She pointed, and I felt my stomach clench. It was a trail of blood. Not much, just a few droplets on the leaves, but unmistakably blood, already dried to a dark brown color. The trail led away from the campsite, toward the denser forest to the north. "That is not the direction of the main trail," Virgil said, coming up beside us. His weathered face was troubled. Nothing that way but deep woods for miles. No established paths, no landmarks. If they went that direction, they went off route. Why would Chester take his group off the established trail? I wondered aloud. The answer, of course, was that he would not willingly, not unless something had forced him to. We followed the blood trail, moving slowly, carefully, watching for any additional evidence. The forest grew denser as we went, the canopy overhead blocking out more and more of the morning light. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I found myself pulling my jacket tighter around my shoulders. The blood trail continued for about half a mile before it simply stopped. One moment there were droplets on the leaves, and the next there was nothing, as if whoever had been bleeding had simply vanished into thin air. We spread out, searching the immediate area for any additional signs. It was Ruth who found the first strange marking. She called us over to a large Douglas fir, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter. At eye level, someone had carved something into the bark. Not carved exactly, more like scratched, with fingernails or a sharp stone. The marks were crude, almost frantic, as if they had been made in a hurry, but they formed a recognizable pattern. It was a spiral that wound inward, tighter and tighter, until it reached a central point. And at that central point, there was a single word, scratched so deep into the bark that the pale wood beneath was exposed. Watching. I stared at that word for a long moment, remembering what Teresa had told me about Chester's transmission. The trees. They are watching. "Ruth, take a photograph of this," I said. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, too calm, too controlled. "Document its exact location on the map." She nodded and pulled out her camera, but I noticed her hands were shaking. "The rest of you, spread out, look for more markings, but stay within visual contact of at least one other team member at all times." We found 7 more spirals carved into trees within a 100-yard radius. Each one had a word at its center. Watching, listening, waiting, hungry, awake, coming. And the last one, carved into a tree that stood alone in a small clearing, deeper than all the others, the letters almost 2 inches tall. Run. I stood in front of that last marking, and I felt something I had not felt since I was a child, alone in the dark, certain that something was lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I felt watched. Not by my team, not by any animal or human presence I could identify, but watched nonetheless, by something hidden in the shadows between the trees, something that had been there long before we arrived and would be there long after we left. "We need to keep moving," Virgil said. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could see the whites of his eyes. "We are losing daylight." He was right. In the mountains, daylight was precious, and we had already spent too much time examining the campsite and the strange markings. I made the call to continue the search, following what little trail evidence we could find. But as we pressed deeper into the forest, I could not shake the feeling that we were not the hunters in this equation. We were the hunted. The forest changed as we moved farther from the established trails. The trees grew older, their trunks thicker, their branches gnarled and twisted like arthritic fingers reaching toward the sky. The undergrowth became denser, tangled with ferns and fallen logs and the decaying remains of trees that had toppled decades ago. And the silence deepened, became almost oppressive, broken only by the sound of our own footsteps and breathing. We found the second campsite around midday. It was not an official campsite, not marked on any map. It was just a small depression between 2 massive boulders, barely large enough for a few tents. But someone had camped here recently. There were the remains of a fire, poorly made, as if by someone who had never built a campfire before. There were scattered food wrappers and empty water bottles, and there were tents, 3 of them, still standing, their flaps open, their contents in disarray. I approached the nearest tent and looked inside. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The interior of the tent had been destroyed, not just disturbed, but systematically torn apart. The sleeping bag had been shredded, the fabric hanging in ribbons. The backpack that lay in one corner had been ripped open, its contents scattered and crushed, and the walls of the tent were covered in more of those spiraling scratches, hundreds of them, overlapping and intersecting until the fabric was almost translucent from all the tiny holes. I backed out of the tent and moved to the next one. The same destruction, and the next, the same. But no bodies, no blood, no sign of what had actually happened to the people who had been sleeping here. "We need to call this in," Thomas said. He was a veteran of many search operations, a calm and steady presence, but even he looked shaken. "Base needs to know what we found." I nodded and reached for my radio, but when I pressed the transmit button, all I got was static. Strange, hissing static that seemed to pulse and surge in an almost rhythmic pattern. I adjusted the frequency, tried again. More static. "Teresa, this is Troy. Do you copy?" Nothing. Just that strange, breathing static. I tried every channel, every frequency. The result was always the same. Our radios were dead, or rather, not dead. Receiving something, but not anything we could understand or respond to. "We are too deep in the valley," Margaret suggested. "The mountains might be blocking the signal." It was a reasonable explanation. Radio communication in mountainous terrain was always unreliable, but I had used this radio in valleys far deeper than this one, and it had never sounded like this. It had never sounded like something was breathing on the other end. We spread out to search the campsite more thoroughly, looking for any clue that might tell us what had happened and where the group might have gone next. It was Virgil who found the journal. It was wedged beneath one of the boulders, as if someone had hidden it there deliberately. The cover was plain brown leather, water-stained and worn. There was no name on it, no identification. I opened it carefully and began to read. The handwriting was neat and precise, clearly feminine. The first entry was dated 6 days ago, Friday. "Started from Mowich Lake this morning. Perfect weather. Chester says we should make good time if it holds. The group is nice. Harold and Edna are sweet, clearly still in love after 40 years of marriage. Walter is quiet but knowledgeable about local plants. Dorothy takes photographs of everything, says she is working on a book. The Whitmore brothers are a bit loud but harmless. Looking forward to the next 4 days." I turned the page. Saturday. Something strange last night. I woke around 2 a.m. needing to use the restroom. When I unzipped my tent, I saw lights in the forest. Not flashlights. These were different. Pale, almost blue, moving between the trees about 100 yards from camp. They did not bob or sway like someone walking. They glided, smooth and silent. I watched for maybe 5 minutes before they faded away. Did not mention it to the others this morning. Did not want to seem crazy. But Chester gave me a strange look at breakfast, like he knew something was bothering me. The next entry was longer, the handwriting slightly less controlled. "Sunday. We are lost. I do not understand how it happened. Chester has hiked this trail hundreds of times. But somehow, we ended up somewhere that is not on the map. The landmarks do not match. The trail markers are gone. Chester tried his compass, but the needle just spins in circles. We made camp early, hoping to get our bearings in the morning, but the mood is tense. Harold is not feeling well. He says he has a headache, but I have seen him touching his ears, wincing like he is hearing something painful. And tonight, when the sun went down, the lights came back. This time, everyone saw them." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I turned to the next page. Monday. We tried to backtrack this morning, but the trail we came in on is gone. Not overgrown, not obscured, gone. Where there was a path yesterday, now there is only dense forest, as if the trail never existed at all. Edna had a breakdown. She kept screaming that the trees were moving, that when she was not looking directly at them, they were shifting position, closing in around us. Chester tried to calm her down, but I could see in his eyes that he was scared too. We are all scared. And last night the sound started. Whispers, not words, not exactly, but almost words. Like a language that is just slightly different from any language you have ever heard. Like something trying to speak, but not quite remembering how. The next entry was written in handwriting that was barely legible, the words scrawled at odd angles across the page. Tuesday. Clarence is gone. He went to gather firewood this morning and never came back. We searched for hours, calling his name. Nothing. But we found his jacket, hanging from a tree branch about 15 feet off the ground. How did it get there? How could it possibly have gotten there? Earl will not stop crying. Chester tried to use the radio to call for help, but something is wrong with it. There is something on the other end, listening. I can hear it breathing. I can hear it waiting. We have to get out of here. But the forest will not let us leave. There was one more entry, written in what looked like a different ink, darker, as if pressed harder into the page. Wednesday. It is in the camp now. I can see it standing at the edge of the firelight. It looks like a person, but it is too tall. Its arms are too long. Its face is wrong. I cannot look at it directly. When I try, my eyes slide away, like they are refusing to see what is really there. The others are asleep. Or maybe they are not asleep. Maybe they are something else now. I do not know. I do not know anything anymore. I am going to hide this journal. Maybe someone will find it. Maybe someone will understand what happened to us. If you are reading this, please, do not stay here after dark. Do not listen to the whispers, and whatever you do, do not look at the trees, because the trees are looking back. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. Around me, my team stood in silence, watching, waiting for me to tell them what to do. I looked up at the sky, judging the position of the sun. We had maybe 4 hours of daylight left, not enough time to get back to the trailhead. We would have to make camp soon. Here, in these woods, these watching woods. We move, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We head east, toward the established trail. We have maybe 2 hours before we need to stop and set up camp for the night. I want everyone to stay close. No one goes anywhere alone, not even to relieve themselves. Understood? They nodded, their faces pale. As we gathered our gear and prepared to move out, I slipped the journal into my pack. Evidence, I told myself, for the investigation. But part of me knew that was not the only reason. Part of me needed to keep those words close, needed to remind myself that I was not imagining things, that this was really happening, whatever this was. We hiked for nearly 2 hours, pushing through dense undergrowth, scrambling over fallen logs, wading through streams that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The forest remained stubbornly unfamiliar, the landmarks I knew from years of patrolling nowhere to be found. It was as if we had stepped through some invisible boundary into a version of Mount Rainier that existed only in nightmares. We made camp in a small clearing beside a rock outcropping that provided some shelter from the wind. The sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that should have been beautiful, but instead felt ominous, like the forest was bleeding. I assigned watches, 2-hour shifts, 2 people at a time. No one complained. No one wanted to be alone in the dark. I took the first watch with Virgil, the 2 of us sitting back to back on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, our flashlights and weapons within easy reach. For the first hour, nothing happened. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, the usual sounds of nocturnal wildlife conspicuously absent. I found myself straining to hear anything, any indication that we were not completely alone out here. Then, around 9 p.m., the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the leaves, but there was no wind. The air was perfectly still. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, a low, susurrant murmur that seemed to seep from the shadows between the trees. I glanced at Virgil. His face was pale in the moonlight, his eyes wide. "You hear it too?" I whispered. He nodded slowly. "It sounds like voices, almost like voices, trying to say something." We sat in tense silence, listening. The whispers continued, rising and falling in pitch, almost forming words but never quite resolving into anything comprehensible. It was maddening, like trying to understand a conversation happening in another room, just barely out of earshot. And then, without warning, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It was the silence of something holding its breath, something waiting. I swept my flashlight across the tree line, the beam cutting through the darkness but revealing nothing but trees and shadows. But there was something there. I could feel it, a presence, massive and ancient and patient, watching us from just beyond the reach of the light. Virgil grabbed my arm suddenly, his grip tight enough to hurt. "There," he hissed, "at the edge of the trees. Do you see it?" I looked where he was pointing, and for a moment, I saw nothing. Just darkness and trees. But then, just for an instant, I caught a glimpse of something. A shape. Tall, impossibly tall, standing motionless between 2 massive firs. Its proportions were wrong, its limbs too long, its body too thin, and its face, if it had a face, was turned toward us. I blinked and it was gone, if it had ever been there at all. We did not sleep that night. None of us did. We sat huddled around the fire, feeding it constantly, keeping the flames high and bright as if they could protect us from whatever was out there in the darkness. When dawn finally came, gray and cold, we broke camp in record time and continued our search. But I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones like ice, that we were no longer searching. We were being herded, guided by something that knew these woods far better than we ever could, led toward a destination we could not imagine and might not survive. The second day in the deep woods was worse than the first. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees growing denser, the undergrowth more tangled. We pushed through thickets that scratched at our skin and tore at our clothes, climbed over fallen logs slick with moss and decay, waded through streams whose waters ran unnaturally cold, and everywhere we went, we found signs of the missing group: a torn piece of clothing hanging from a branch, a crushed granola bar wrapper on the ground, a blood-stained bandage wrapped around the base of a tree. We followed these breadcrumbs deeper and deeper into the wilderness, and with each one we found, my sense of dread grew stronger. It was Margaret who spotted the cabin. We had emerged from a particularly dense section of forest into a small valley, and there it was, nestled against the base of a steep hillside. A cabin. Old, weathered, its logs gray with age, its roof covered in moss. But unmistakably a cabin, a human structure in the middle of nowhere. "That is not on any map," Virgil said. His voice was hushed, almost reverent. "I have been hiking these mountains for 50 years. I have never seen this place before." We approached cautiously, weapons drawn. The cabin appeared abandoned, its single window dark, its door hanging slightly open on rusted hinges. But as we got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the mud around the entrance. Fresh footprints, multiple sets, some going in, none coming out. I signaled for the team to spread out, covering the windows and the back of the structure. Then I approached the door, my flashlight in one hand, my pistol in the other. I pushed the door open with my foot and swept the beam of my flashlight across the interior. The smell hit me first. The thick, cloying stench of decay, of something organic rotting in an enclosed space. I gagged, fighting the urge to turn away, and forced myself to look. The cabin was a single room, maybe 15 feet by 20 feet. The walls were bare wood, uninsulated, the gaps between logs letting in thin streams of gray daylight. There was a rough wooden table in the center of the room, a cast iron stove in one corner, and a set of crudely built bunk beds against the far wall. And there were symbols, hundreds of them, carved into every surface. Spirals and circles and patterns that hurt to look at, that seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision. They covered the walls, the floor, the ceiling. They covered the furniture. They covered everything. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what was on the bunk beds. There were bodies, 3 of them, lying side by side, their hands folded neatly on their chests, their eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. But their skin was gray, almost blue, and their faces were frozen in expressions of absolute terror. I recognized them from the photographs Teresa had shown me during the briefing. Harold and Edna Patterson, and Dorothy Shaw. I stepped closer, forcing myself to examine the bodies. There were no visible wounds. No obvious cause of death. They simply looked like they had lain down on those beds and never gotten up again. Like something had frightened them so badly that their hearts had simply stopped. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Margaret standing in the doorway, her face pale, her hand pressed over her mouth. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God, what happened to them?" "I do not know," I said. "But we need to document this and keep moving. There are still 4 people unaccounted for." We photographed the scene from every angle, noting the position of the bodies, the strange symbols on the walls, every detail that might help us understand what had happened. Then we searched the cabin for any clues that might lead us to the remaining missing persons. It was Thomas who found the trapdoor. It was hidden beneath a tattered rug near the cast iron stove, its edges barely visible against the rough wooden floor. He called us over, and together, we pulled the door open. A rush of cold air hit us, carrying with it a smell of earth and dampness and something else, something organic and alien that I could not identify. Below the trapdoor was a wooden ladder, leading down into darkness. I shone my flashlight into the hole, but the beam was swallowed by the shadows before it could reveal what lay below. "Someone has been down there recently," Thomas said. He pointed to the ladder rungs, which were smeared with mud and what looked like dried blood. "And those are drag marks leading to the edge." I looked at my team. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear, but they were professionals, and they knew what had to be done. "I will go down first," I said. "Margaret, you follow me. Thomas, Virgil, Ruth, stay up here. Keep watch. If we are not back in 30 minutes, Get out and call for backup." They nodded, though I could see they wanted to argue. I gave them what I hoped was a reassuring look. Then I started down the ladder. The descent was longer than I expected, at least 20 feet. The walls of the shaft were rough-hewn rock, damp with moisture that seeped from somewhere underground. The smell grew stronger as I went down, that strange organic odor mixing with the cold earthen smell of deep underground. When my feet finally touched solid ground, I found myself in a tunnel. It was narrow, barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast, and it stretched away into darkness in both directions. The walls were covered in more of those spiraling symbols, carved deep into the rock, and they seemed to glow faintly in the beam of my flashlight, though that had to be a trick of the light. Margaret landed beside me a moment later, her breathing rapid and shallow. "Which way?" she whispered. I looked left, then right. Both directions looked equally ominous, equally unknown. But then I noticed something on the ground, leading to the right. More drag marks, and more blood. This way. We followed the tunnel for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes widening into small chambers, sometimes narrowing until we had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The symbols on the walls became more elaborate as we went deeper, more complex, until they formed what almost looked like pictures, images of things I could not quite make out, but that filled me with a nameless dread. And then we heard the voices, not whispers this time, actual voices, human voices, speaking in tones of terror and desperation. "Help us, please. Someone help us. They are coming back. Please, you have to help us." I broke into a run, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted down the tunnel toward the source of the sounds. I rounded a corner and skidded to a halt, my breath catching in my throat. It was a chamber, a large chamber at least 50 feet across, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. And in the center of the chamber, huddled together like frightened animals, were 4 people: Chester Millwood, Walter Fleming, and the Whitmore brothers, Earl and Clarence. They were alive. The survivors were in bad shape, dehydrated, malnourished, covered in cuts and bruises and what looked like claw marks, long parallel scratches that ran down their arms and legs. But they were alive, and when they saw us, they broke down in tears of relief. "Thank God," Chester rasped. His voice was raw, barely above a whisper. "I thought no one would ever find us. I thought we were going to die down here." I knelt beside him, offering him water from my canteen. "What happened?" I asked. "Where is the rest of your group?" Chester's face crumbled. "Dead. They are all dead. It took them, one by one. It would come at night when we were sleeping. It would take them, and we would hear them screaming. But we could never find them. We could never help them. And then yesterday it brought them back. It brought their bodies back. It left them in that cabin, arranged them like they were sleeping. And then it..." He broke off, unable to continue. "It is still here," Earl whispered. He was younger than his brother, maybe early 30s, with a scraggly beard and eyes that held a haunted, broken look. "It lives in these tunnels. It has been here for a long time, maybe forever, and it is not done with us yet." "What is it?" Margaret asked. "What did you see?" The survivors exchanged glances, and in their eyes I saw something that chilled me to the bone. I saw the look of people who had witnessed something that their minds refused to fully process, something that violated every law of nature and reason that they had ever known. "I do not know what it is," Chester said finally. "It looks different every time. Sometimes it looks almost human. Sometimes it looks like shadows and teeth and eyes. And sometimes it looks like the forest itself, like the trees are alive and hungry and reaching for us. But I know what it wants." I waited. "It wants us to stay," he said. "It wants us to be part of this place, to become like the others." I did not ask what others he meant. I was not sure I wanted to know. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Can you walk?" They could, barely. We helped them to their feet and began the long journey back through the tunnels, back toward the ladder in the cabin and the surface world above. But we had only gone a few hundred feet when we heard it. A sound, deep and resonant, like a massive bell tolling somewhere in the earth below us. It vibrated through the rock walls, through the floor, through our very bones. And in the wake of that sound, the whispers began again, louder this time, more urgent. Almost words, almost comprehensible, but not quite. And they were coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the ceiling, from the darkness ahead of us and behind us. We ran. There was no other option. We ran through those twisting tunnels, half carrying the survivors, our flashlights bouncing wildly, our shadows dancing on the walls like living things. Behind us, I could hear something following, something large, something that moved through the darkness with a fluid, inhuman grace. I did not look back. I did not dare. We reached the ladder and scrambled up, one after another, pulling and pushing the survivors who were too weak to climb on their own. Margaret went first, then Chester, then the Whitmore brothers, then Walter. I went last, and as I climbed, I felt something brush against my ankle. Cold, impossibly cold, and somehow wet, like touching raw meat that had been left in a freezer. I kicked out instinctively and felt my boot connect with something solid. There was a sound, a high-pitched shriek that echoed through the shaft and seemed to pierce directly into my brain. And then I was through the trapdoor, rolling onto the cabin floor, and Thomas was slamming the door shut behind me. "Go!" I shouted. "Everyone out now!" We did not need to be told twice. We burst out of the cabin and into the gray daylight, and we ran. We ran without looking back, without stopping, without caring about direction or destination. We just ran. And behind us, from the cabin, from the forest, from everywhere and nowhere, I heard that sound again. That deep, resonant tolling. And underneath it, like a harmony from hell, the whispers. Whispering our names. We ran until we could not run anymore, until our lungs burned and our legs gave out and we collapsed in a heap in a small clearing miles from the cabin. The sun was setting again, the shadows lengthening, and I knew we did not have long before full darkness fell. I forced myself to my feet and began organizing camp. We had no tents, no proper supplies, just the emergency gear in our packs. But we made do. We built a fire, a big one, and we huddled around it like prehistoric humans, drawing comfort from the flames, from the light that pushed back the encroaching darkness. The survivors told us their story in halting, fragmented sentences. They told us how the forest had seemed to change around them, how trails had vanished and landmarks had shifted. They told us about the lights in the night, the whispers, the growing sense that they were being watched by something vast and malevolent. They told us about the first disappearance, and the second, and the third. About finding the bodies, arranged neatly, peacefully, as if death had been a mercy. And they told us about the thing in the tunnels, the thing that had hunted them through the darkness, that had toyed with them, that had seemed to take pleasure in their fear. They did not describe it in detail. They could not. Every time they tried, their words would falter, their eyes would glaze over, and they would start to tremble uncontrollably. Whatever they had seen down there, it had broken something inside them, something that might never heal. We took turns keeping watch throughout the night. The whispers came and went, sometimes barely audible, sometimes so loud they seemed to drown out our own thoughts. But nothing emerged from the darkness, nothing that we could see anyway. Though more than once, I caught glimpses of movement at the edge of the firelight, shapes that were too tall, too thin, too wrong to be human. Shapes that watched and waited and did not move when I shone my flashlight directly at them. When dawn finally came, it felt like a reprieve from a death sentence. We packed up quickly, efficiently, and began the long trek back toward civilization. I had given up on finding the established trail. Instead, I navigated by compass and instinct, heading generally east, toward where I knew the park headquarters had to be. But the forest did not make it easy. Trees that should not have been there blocked our path. Streams appeared where no streams were marked on any map. And more than once, I could have sworn we passed the same distinctive boulder or fallen log twice, as if the forest was looping back on itself, trying to keep us trapped. It took us 3 days to find our way out. 3 days of exhausting hiking, of rationed food and water, of nights spent huddled around fires that never seemed bright enough. 3 days of whispers and shadows and the constant, overwhelming sense that something was following us, watching us, waiting for the moment we let our guard down. On the 3rd day, we emerged from the tree line onto a gravel road that I recognized. It was a maintenance road used by Park Service vehicles, and it led directly to the Moich Lake trailhead. I have never been so happy to see a gravel road in my life. We reached the ranger station that evening. Teresa was there, along with Eugene and the other search teams who had been looking for us. When they saw us emerge from the forest, haggard and hollow-eyed, with 4 survivors in tow, there were tears and embraces and a flood of questions. I answered as best I could, but I knew even as I spoke that my words were inadequate. How do you describe something like what we had experienced? How do you explain the inexplicable? The survivors were taken to the hospital, treated for their physical injuries, evaluated for psychological trauma. The official report listed their ordeal as the result of getting lost in the backcountry, of dehydration and exposure leading to hallucinations and confusion. A tragic accident. A cautionary tale. No mention was made of the cabin, or the tunnels, or the thing that had hunted them through the darkness. No mention was made of the 3 bodies we had found, which search teams were unable to locate when they returned to the area a week later. The cabin, they reported, was gone, as if it had never existed at all. I did not argue with the official report. I did not try to convince anyone of what I had seen. What would be the point? Some things are not meant to be believed. Some things are not meant to be understood. They are only meant to be survived. That was 6 months ago. I still work for the Park Service, still patrol these forests every day. But something has changed. I notice things now that I never noticed before. The way the shadows move when there is no wind. The way certain groves of trees seem to watch me as I pass. The way the radio sometimes crackles with static that sounds almost like whispers. Chester Millwood retired. He sold his house, moved to Arizona, said he never wanted to see a forest again as long as he lived. I understand the feeling. The Whitmore brothers do not talk to each other anymore. Earl told me once that every time he looks at his brother, he sees the thing from the tunnels looking back at him. Walter Fleming went back to teaching, but his students say he is different now. Quieter, more distant. He never turns his back to the windows. I keep the journal from the campsite locked in a drawer in my cabin. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and read through those final entries. The handwriting of a woman who knew she was going to die, who had witnessed something that defied all rational explanation. I never learned her name. There was no Dorothy Shaw listed in the official records of the missing group. No evidence that she had ever existed at all. But I have her words, and I have my memories. And I have the certainty, deep in my bones, that what I experienced in those woods was real. The thing in the forest, the thing in the tunnels, it is still out there, still waiting, still watching. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the night is dark enough, I can almost hear it calling my name. I have learned to live with that knowledge, to carry it with me like a stone in my pocket, a constant weight that never quite goes away. Because that is what happens when you survive something like what we survived. You do not move on. You do not forget. You just learn to carry it, and you hope, with every fiber of your being, that it never comes calling again. The park closed the Wonderland Trail near Moich Lake for 2 months after our return. Official reason given was trail damage from spring flooding. Unofficial reason was that 3 more hikers went missing in that area in the weeks following our rescue, and the search teams sent to find them reported the same strange phenomena we had experienced. Radios that filled with static and whispers. Trails that seemed to shift and change, and in one case, a ranger who claimed to have seen a figure standing at the edge of his campsite at night, watching him with eyes that reflected no light. The trail reopened eventually. It always does. The Park Service cannot afford to keep popular trails closed indefinitely, and the official explanations, however inadequate, seem to satisfy the public. But I noticed that certain rangers refused to patrol that area anymore, that certain maintenance routes were quietly reassigned, that there was an unspoken understanding among the old-timers that some parts of the mountain were best left alone. I tried to research the history of the area, hoping to find some explanation for what we had encountered. What I found only deepened the mystery. The Native American tribes who had lived in this region for thousands of years had names for certain places on the mountain. Names that translated to phrases like where the spirits walk and the hungry forest and the place of watching eyes. They had stories too. Stories of hunters who ventured into certain valleys and never returned. Stories of shapes that moved between the trees on moonless nights. Stories of a presence, ancient and patient and not quite malevolent, but certainly not benevolent either, that claimed certain parts of the mountain as its own. And they had warnings that were passed down from generation to generation, embedded in their culture like survival instincts. Do not camp alone in certain places. Do not look at certain things directly. Do not speak certain names aloud after dark. I found references to similar phenomena in the journals of early European explorers and settlers. Accounts of expeditions that vanished without a trace. Reports of strange lights and sounds in the wilderness. Descriptions of structures, cabins, and foundations and carved stones that seemed to appear and disappear at random, that were never in the same place twice. And through it all, a common thread. A sense that there was something in these mountains that predated human habitation. Something that had been here when the first people arrived, and would still be here long after the last person left. Something that watched and waited, and occasionally, when the mood struck it, reached out to touch the human world in ways that left scars on everyone involved. I do not know what that something is. I have theories, of course. Everyone who has experienced what I experienced develops theories. Some of my colleagues believe it is a natural phenomenon, some kind of electromagnetic anomaly or geological formation that affects human perception and cognition. Others think it is something psychological, a collective hallucination triggered by stress and isolation and the primal fear of the wilderness that all humans carry in their genes. And some, the ones who have seen it up close, believe it is something else entirely, something that does not fit into any category we have words for, something outside our understanding of how the universe works. I lean toward that last theory, though I know how crazy it sounds, because I have seen things in these woods that cannot be explained by science or psychology. I have felt the presence of something vast and ancient and aware, and I have heard the whispers, the almost words that seem to carry meaning just beyond the edge of comprehension. Whatever it is real, and it is still out there. A year after the incident, I received a letter. It came to the ranger station, addressed to me by name, with no return address. The envelope was old, yellowed with age, and the stamps were vintage, dating back to the 1950s. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in an elegant, old-fashioned script. It read, "You found the cabin. You went into the tunnels. You heard the whispers and saw the shapes and felt the cold touch of something that should not exist. You are not the first, and you will not be the last. The mountain has many secrets, Ranger Troy, secrets that go back further than human memory, further than human understanding. You survived because it allowed you to survive, because it was not yet hungry, because it was curious about you, about all of you, and wanted to see what you would do. But curiosity fades, and hunger returns. Be careful in the dark places, Ranger Troy. Be careful what you see and what you hear and what you believe. Because belief is a door, and once you open it, you can never close it again. The watching ones are always watching. And someday, when the time is right, they will come for what they are owed." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it or how they knew my name or what had happened to us in those woods. I showed the letter to Teresa, who had no explanation. I showed it to Eugene, who simply shook his head and told me to burn it. I did not burn it. I keep it with the journal, in the locked drawer in my cabin. More evidence, I tell myself, more documentation of the inexplicable. But really, I think I keep it because it makes me feel less alone. Because it tells me that others have experienced what I experienced. That others have seen the watching ones, heard the whispers, survived the touch of something from beyond the edge of human understanding. I am not special. I am not chosen. I am just one of many. A single drop in a long stream of people who have wandered too deep into the dark places and emerged, changed, haunted, marked. 2 years after the incident, Chester Millwood died. Heart attack, the official report said. Natural causes. He was found in his apartment in Phoenix, sitting in a chair facing the window, his eyes wide open, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. When I heard the news, I was not surprised. I had known somehow that Chester would never be free of what we had experienced, that the mountain had marked him in ways that went deeper than physical scars, that he was one of them now. One of the lost, even though his body had escaped. I attended his funeral. It was a small affair, just a handful of former colleagues and distant relatives. At the reception afterward, his sister approached me. She was an older woman, thin and tired-looking, with Chester's eyes. "You were there," she said, "in the mountains, when it happened." I nodded. "He talked about you," she said. "In the end, he said you were strong, stronger than he was. He said you could hear the whispers and not let them in." I did not know what to say to that. "He left something for you," she continued. She handed me a small box wrapped in brown paper. "He said you would know what to do with it." I opened the box later, alone in my cabin. Inside was Chester's compass, the one that had spun in circles in the deep woods, the one that had refused to point north. But now, when I held it in my hand, the needle moved. It swung slowly, deliberately, until it pointed not north, not south, but directly toward the window, toward the mountain, toward Mowich Lake. I understood then what Chester was trying to tell me. The connection we had forged with that place, with whatever lived there, was not something that could be broken. It was permanent, eternal, a thread that stretched across time and space, linking us to the watching ones forever. I put the compass in the drawer with the journal and the letter. More evidence, more reminders, more weight to carry. 5 years have passed since the incident on the Wonderland Trail. 5 years of nightmares and sleepless nights, and the constant gnawing sense that something is following me, watching me, waiting for the right moment to reach out and touch me again. I have learned to live with it. Most days, I barely notice anymore. The fear has become like background noise, a constant hum that I have trained myself to ignore. But there are moments. Moments when the radio crackles with static that sounds like whispers. Moments when I catch a glimpse of something at the edge of my vision, tall and wrong and watching. Moments when I wake in the middle of the night, certain that something is standing at the foot of my bed, its eyes reflecting no light. In those moments, the fear comes flooding back, raw and primal and overwhelming. And I remember that I am not safe. None of us are, because the watching ones are always watching, and they are patient. They have been waiting for thousands of years, maybe millions. They can wait a little longer. I tell myself this is just paranoia, just the after effects of trauma, the way a soldier flinches at loud noises long after the war is over. But I know better. I have seen what is out there, in the dark places of the mountain. I have felt its attention on me, cold and vast and utterly alien. And I know that someday it will come for me, maybe tomorrow. Maybe next year, maybe decades from now when I am old and weak and unable to run. But it will come. And when it does, I will not be able to escape. No one escapes. Not really. Chester did not escape. He just got a few extra years, a few more breaths, a few more sunrises before the darkness finally claimed him. I expect the same. We all expect the same, those of us who have been touched by the mountain. We carry our survival like a temporary reprieve, a stay of execution that can be revoked at any moment. And we wait. That is all we can do. Wait and watch and hope that when the end comes, it comes quickly. But here is the thing about fear. It does not last forever. Even the deepest terror fades with time, becomes manageable, becomes almost comfortable. You learn to live alongside it, like a chronic illness or a difficult neighbor. It shapes you, changes you, becomes part of who you are. And eventually, you realize that the fear is not just a burden. It is a gift, a reminder that you are still alive. That you survived something that should have killed you, that you looked into the face of the unknown and came back to tell the story. That is what I tell myself anyway. On the good days, on the bad days, I just try to get through until morning. I still work for the Park Service, still patrol these forests, still help lost hikers find their way home. I am good at my job, maybe better than I was before, because now I know what is really out there. I know the dangers that do not appear on any map, the threats that cannot be quantified or prepared for. And I know that my job is not just to rescue people from the wilderness. It is to protect them from the things that live in the spaces between the trees, the things that watch and wait and whisper in the dark. New rangers sometimes ask me about the incident. They have heard rumors, fragments of stories passed down through the grapevine. They want to know what really happened out there, what I saw, what I believe. I tell them the official story: lost hikers, bad weather, tragic accident. I do not tell them about the cabin or the tunnels or the thing that hunted us through the darkness. Some things are not meant to be shared. Some knowledge is too heavy to pass on. Better to let them believe in a safe, rational world. Better to let them think the only dangers out here are bears and hypothermia and getting lost. They will find out the truth eventually if they stay in these mountains long enough. Everyone does. And when they come to me, hollow-eyed and shaking, trying to explain something they saw that defied all explanation, I will be there to listen, to nod, to tell them they are not crazy. That is my real job now. Not rescuing bodies, but rescuing minds. Helping people process the unprocessable. Showing them that it is possible to carry the weight of the impossible and still keep walking. Because that is what we do. Those of us who have been touched by the watching ones. We keep walking. We keep breathing. We keep going through the motions of a normal life, even though we know that nothing will ever be normal again. And we hope. Hope that the darkness stays in the dark places. Hope that the whispers stay just beyond the edge of hearing. Hope that the watching ones stay content to watch and do not decide to reach out and touch us again. It is not much, but it is enough. It has to be enough. The summer after the 5th anniversary, something changed. I noticed it first in the small things, the way the shadows seemed darker than they should be, the way the animals in the forest were more skittish, more prone to fleeing at the slightest sound, the way the radios picked up more static, more interference, more of those almost words that haunted my nightmares. Then the reports started coming in. Hikers on the Wonderland Trail reporting strange experiences. Lights in the woods at night. Sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The sense of being watched, followed, hunted by something they could not see. 3 people went missing in June. 2 more in July. And in August, an entire Boy Scout troop vanished from their campsite near Mowich Lake, leaving behind nothing but their tents and supplies and a single spiral carved into the bark of a nearby tree. The Park Service launched a massive search operation. Hundreds of personnel, helicopters, dogs, every resource we had. We searched for 3 weeks, covering every inch of the surrounding wilderness. We found nothing, not a single trace, not a single clue. Just empty forest and the endless whisper of the wind through the trees, and the watching. Always the watching. I could feel it stronger than ever now. That vast, patient attention focused on our efforts like a child watching ants scramble around their crushed anthill. It was not malevolent exactly. More like curious. Interested. Amused by our futile attempts to find what could not be found. The official explanation was a freak storm. A sudden weather event that swept the boys away before they could reach shelter. Tragic. Unforeseeable. A reminder of the dangers of the wilderness. The parents did not believe it. How could they? But there was nothing else to tell them. Nothing that would make sense. Nothing that would help. I attended the memorial service. Stood at the back of the church, watching families weep for children who would never come home. And I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Anger. Not at the watching ones. You cannot be angry at a force of nature, at something so far beyond human understanding that emotion itself becomes meaningless, but anger at myself. For knowing what was out there and not being able to stop it. For carrying this knowledge like a secret shame, when maybe, just maybe, if I had spoken up sooner, those boys might still be alive. But even as I thought it, I knew it was foolish. There was nothing I could have done. Nothing anyone could have done. The watching ones take what they want, when they want it. We are not players in their game. We are pieces, pawns, snacks. That night, I made a decision. I would go back to Mowich Lake, not as part of an official search, not with a team of rangers and volunteers. Just me, alone, with nothing but my pack and my weapon and 20 years of experience in these woods. I would find the cabin, I would go into the tunnels, and I would try, one more time, to understand what was happening on this mountain. It was stupid, suicidal, probably, but I was tired of waiting, tired of watching, tired of being a passive participant in a horror story that had no end. If the watching ones wanted me, they could have me, but I was not going to make it easy for them. I was going to look them in the eye. I was going to demand answers. And if I died in the attempt, at least I would die doing something. At least I would die fighting. I told Teresa I was taking a week of personal leave. She looked at me with those knowing eyes, the eyes of someone who has seen too much and learned to stop asking questions. "Be careful, Troy," she said. "Whatever you are planning, be careful." "I will," I lied. I set out on a Monday morning, just as the sun was rising over the mountain. The trail to Mowich Lake was familiar, a path I had walked hundreds of times over the years. But it felt different now. Charged, electric, like the air before a thunderstorm. I made good time, reaching the lake by early afternoon. The water was still, mirror smooth, reflecting the sky and the surrounding peaks with perfect clarity. It was beautiful, peaceful, and utterly wrong. The silence was the first thing I noticed. No birds, no insects, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, just the sound of my own breathing and the soft lap of water against the shore. I made camp at the official campsite, setting up my tent and building a small fire. As darkness fell, I sat by the flames and waited. I did not have to wait long. The whispers started around midnight. Soft at first, barely audible, like the murmur of a distant conversation. But they grew louder as the hours passed, more insistent, more urgent. And this time, I did not try to block them out. I listened, really listened, for the first time since that terrible week 5 years ago. And slowly, gradually, I began to understand. Not the words themselves. The whispers were not in any human language, but the meaning behind them, the intent, the emotion. They were not threatening. They were not malevolent. They were curious, interested, welcoming even, in a strange, alien way. They wanted me to come. They wanted to show me something. They wanted me to understand. I stood up from the fire, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder, guiding me, leading me away from the campsite and into the dark forest beyond. I followed without hesitation. The whispers led me through the trees, along paths that seemed to appear just as I needed them and vanish just as quickly. The forest shifted and changed around me, the landmarks I knew replaced by unfamiliar groves and clearings that seemed to glow with a faint inner light. And then, suddenly, I was there. The cabin. It stood before me, exactly as I remembered it, old, weathered, covered in moss. But this time, there was a light in the window, a warm, golden glow that spilled out into the darkness like a beacon. I approached slowly, my hand on my weapon, every sense alert for danger. But the whispers had faded to a gentle murmur, almost soothing, almost friendly, as if they were telling me there was nothing to fear. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The cabin was different than before. Gone were the bodies, the symbols, the overwhelming stench of death. Instead, the room was warm, comfortable, almost cozy. A fire crackled in the cast iron stove. A pot of something fragrant simmered on top. And sitting at the rough wooden table, as if she had been waiting for me, was an old woman. She looked ancient, impossibly ancient. Her face was a map of wrinkles, her hair white and thin, her eyes milky with cataracts. But she smiled when she saw me, a warm, grandmotherly smile that seemed utterly out of place in this strange and terrible location. "Sit down, Ranger Troy," she said. Her voice was soft, papery, like the rustle of dead leaves. "You have come a long way. I have been waiting." I sat. I do not know why. Maybe because the alternative was to flee screaming into the night. Maybe because some part of me recognized that this was why I had come, to find answers, to understand. The old woman poured 2 cups of tea from a chipped ceramic pot and slid one across the table toward me. I did not drink it. "You have questions," she said. "Everyone who comes here has questions, but the answers are not always what you expect." I found my voice. "Who are you?" "I am a caretaker," she said. "A keeper of the threshold. I have had many names over the years, but none of them matter. What matters is the place, the mountain, the watching ones." "What are they?" I asked. The question I had been carrying for 5 years, finally spoken aloud. She smiled again, but this time there was something sad in it, something ancient and weary. "They are what was here before," she said, "before the tribes. Before the animals, before the trees themselves. They are the original inhabitants of this place, the ones who were born when the mountain first rose from the earth. They are not good or evil, they simply are. Like the wind, like the rain, like time itself. Then why do they take people? Why do they hunt and kill and terrify?" She shook her head. "They do not hunt. They do not kill. They collect. They take what interests them, what catches their attention, and they keep it, preserve it, study it for eternity. The ones who are taken are not dead. They are just elsewhere, in a place that human minds cannot comprehend." I thought of the bodies in the cabin, Harold and Edna Patterson, Dorothy Shaw, their faces frozen in terror. "Those were dead," I said. "I saw them. I touched them. Their bodies died," the old woman agreed. "But their essences, their selves, are still with the watching ones, still being studied, still being experienced. I do not know if that is better or worse than oblivion. I do not know if anything is." I felt sick, horrified, but also, strangely, relieved. Because at least now I knew. At least now I understood what had been haunting me for all these years. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you came back," she said. "Because you had the courage to face the darkness instead of running from it. The watching ones respect that. They have marked you as one of theirs, but they have also marked you as worthy, as someone who might be able to bridge the gap between our world and theirs." "What does that mean?" "It means you have a choice, Ranger Troy. You can leave here tonight, go back to your life, and live out your remaining years in peace. The watching ones will not trouble you again. Your debt is paid." She paused, her milky eyes somehow meeting mine with perfect precision. "Or you can stay. Learn what I know. Become a caretaker yourself, a keeper of the threshold, a guide for those who wander too deep into the dark places and need help finding their way back." It was not much of a choice, not really. I thought about my life, my career, the endless patrols through forests that no longer felt safe or welcoming. I thought about the weight I had been carrying, the fear that never quite went away. And I thought about Chester Millwood, dying alone in his apartment, his eyes wide with terror, still running from something he could never escape. I did not want to end up like Chester. I did not want to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the darkness to catch up with me. But more than that, I wanted to help. I wanted to protect the people who came to these mountains seeking beauty and adventure and connection with nature. I wanted to be a guide, a guardian, a keeper of the threshold, even if it meant giving up everything I had known, even if it meant becoming something other than human. I reached across the table and took the old woman's hand. It was cold, impossibly cold, like touching something that had been dead for centuries. But there was strength in that grip, strength and purpose and a strange, timeless wisdom. "Teach me," I said. She smiled, and the whispers rose around us like a chorus, welcoming me home. That was 3 years ago. I am still a ranger, technically. I still wear the uniform, still patrol the trails, still help lost hikers find their way back to civilization. But I am other things now, too. Things that do not have names in any human language. Things that exist in the spaces between what is known and what is feared. The old woman is gone. She passed through the threshold a few months after we met, her work finally done after centuries of service. I found her body in the cabin one morning, sitting peacefully at the table, a gentle smile on her ancient face. I buried her beneath a Douglas fir at the edge of the clearing, marked the grave with a stone carved with one of the symbols the Watching Ones use. She had taught me so much about the history of the mountain and the beings who inhabit it, about the rituals and practices that keep the boundaries stable, about the responsibility of being a keeper of the threshold, a bridge between two worlds that were never meant to touch. And she taught me about the Watching Ones themselves. They are not what I expected, not monsters, not demons, not malevolent spirits seeking to harm humanity. They are something older, something stranger, something that exists outside our categories of good and evil. They watch because that is their nature. They collect because they are curious. They preserve the things they take because they want to understand, to experience, to know what it means to be human in a way that is impossible for beings like them. It does not make what they do right. It does not excuse the suffering they have caused, the families they have destroyed, the lives they have cut short. But it helps me understand, and understanding is the first step toward finding balance. I have found ways to communicate with them, not through words, but through symbols, through rituals, through acts of intent that they can perceive and respond to. I have negotiated, bartered, pleaded with them to show restraint, to take only those who wander too deep, too far, too willingly into the dark places, to leave the innocent alone. Sometimes they listen, sometimes they do not, but more often than not, I can feel their attention on me when I make my requests. I can feel them considering, weighing, deciding, and more often than not, they choose to show mercy. The disappearances have slowed, not stopped entirely, but slowed. The Boy Scout troop was the last major incident. Since then, only a handful of solitary hikers have vanished, all of them in places where the boundaries are thin, all of them after ignoring warnings that any sensible person would have heeded. I tell myself, it is progress. I tell myself I am making a difference. But deep down, I know the truth. The Watching Ones are ancient. They have been here for millions of years and will be here for millions more. My influence is temporary. My negotiations are a drop in an endless ocean. Someday, when I am gone, the balance will shift again, the taking will resume, and another keeper will have to be found to stand in the gap. But that is a problem for another day. For now, I do what I can. I patrol the trails. I guide the lost back to safety. I perform the rituals that keep the boundaries stable, and I listen to the whispers, always present now, a constant companion in my mind. Sometimes they tell me things, warn me of dangers, guide me to people who need help, share glimpses of knowledge that no human has ever possessed. Sometimes they simply watch, a vast, patient attention that I have learned to accept rather than fear. I am not human anymore, not entirely. The threshold changes everyone who crosses it, marks them in ways that cannot be undone. I do not age the way I used to. I do not feel cold or hunger or fatigue the way I once did. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see something behind my eyes that was not there before. Something ancient, something watching. But I am still Troy, still the ranger who set out into the wilderness all those years ago, determined to find answers. Still the man who faced the darkness and chose to become part of it rather than run from it. I do not regret my choice. The fear is still there sometimes. The nightmares still come. But they are quieter now, more manageable. I have made peace with the mountain and the things that live within it. I have found my purpose, my place in the endless cycle of watching and being watched. And when my time finally comes, when the Watching Ones decide to collect me and add me to their eternal archive, I will go willingly. I will cross the threshold one last time and become part of something vast and strange and incomprehensible. I will be studied, preserved, experienced, and maybe, in some way that human language cannot express, I will understand at last what the watching ones have been trying to teach me all along. The mountain keeps its secrets. It always has. It always will. But now, I am one of those secrets. A keeper of the threshold. A guardian of the gap between worlds. And if you ever find yourself on the Wonderland Trail near Mowich Lake, if you ever feel the whispers at the edge of your hearing or catch a glimpse of something tall and wrong standing at the edge of the trees, do not be afraid. Well, be a little afraid. Fear is healthy. Fear keeps you alive. But know that there is someone watching over you, someone who understands what waits in the darkness and has learned to walk alongside it, someone who will do everything in their power to guide you back to the light. That someone is me, and I will be watching the end, or rather, the beginning, because in these mountains, nothing ever truly ends. The watching ones have been here since before the first breath of wind stirred the first leaf on the first tree. They will be here long after the last human voice falls silent. And between now and then, there is work to be done, boundaries to maintain, thresholds to guard, lost souls to guide home. This is my purpose now, my calling, my gift and my curse, wrapped together in an endless spiral that winds ever deeper into the heart of the unknown. I would not have it any other way. The radio crackles, Teresa's voice tight with urgency. Troy, you copy? We have got missing hikers. I press the transmit button. Copy that, Teresa. Where? The static clears for a moment, just long enough for me to hear her answer. Wonderland Trail, near Mowich Lake. I smile. I cannot help it. Some things never change. On my way, I say. And I am walking before the words are even out of my mouth, moving through the forest with the easy grace of someone who has learned its secrets, heading toward another rescue, another encounter, another chance to bridge the gap between worlds. The whispers rise around me like old friends, welcoming me back to the threshold. And somewhere in the depths of the watching darkness, I sense a vast, patient attention turning toward me, curious, interested, approving. Good luck, Ranger Troy, the mountain seems to say. May you find what you are looking for. I do not answer. I do not need to. We understand each other now, the mountain and I. We are partners in an ancient dance, bound together by purpose and necessity and something that might, in the right light, be called love. And so I walk on, into the shadows, into the unknown, into the endless mystery that waits at the edge of every map, just beyond the last marked trail. The forest closes around me like a living thing. The whispers guide my steps, and the watching ones watch, as they always have, as they always will, until the end of time and beyond. This is my story. The story of a ranger who wandered too deep and found something that changed him forever. The story of a mountain that keeps its secrets and guards them jealously. The story of the watching ones, ancient and patient and eternally curious about the small, brief lives that flicker and fade in the shadows of their domain. But it is also your story. Because the wilderness is not just a place on a map, it is a state of mind. A threshold that exists wherever the unknown brushes against the known. And sooner or later, we all find ourselves standing at that threshold, looking into the darkness, wondering what looks back. When that moment comes, remember what I have told you. Remember the whispers and the watchers and the keeper of the threshold. Remember that there is more to this world than what you can see and measure and explain. And remember that fear, while necessary, is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of wisdom. It is the first step toward understanding. It is the door that leads, if you are brave enough to open it, to places beyond imagining. Walk carefully, my friends. Watch where you step and what you say and where you shine your light. The wilderness is beautiful, but it is not safe. It has never been safe. And in the deepest, darkest places, where the trees grow tall and the shadows grow deep and the whispers never stop, something is always watching, something ancient, something patient, something that knows your name, the end.